The truth about the music was that most of the grunts Sully remembered used to get choked up over the Carpenters or Angel of the Morning. That stuff was the real Bush soundtrack. Always playing as the men passed around fatties and pictures of their girlfriends, getting stoned and all weepy-goopy over One Tin Soldier, popularly known in the green as the theme from fucking Billy Jack. Sully couldn't remember hearing the Doors once in Vietnam. It was always the Strawberry Alarm Clock singing Incense and Peppermints. On some level, he had known the war was lost the first time he heard that fucking piece of shit on the commissary jukebox. The reunions started with music and the smell of barbecues, a smell that always vaguely reminded Sully of burning helicopter fuel, and with cans of beer and pails of chipped ice, and that part was all right. That part was actually pretty nice. But then all at once it was the next morning, and the light burned your eyes, and your head felt like a tumor, and your stomach was full of poison. On one of those mornings...
If you can guess the characters I make and what they're from, you're a badass. You know Nick Andros? He don't believe in God. But that don't matter, Nick. He believes in you. Anyway.
Mornings after, Sully had a vague, sick memory of making the DJ play Oh, Carol by Neil Sedaka over and over again, threatening to kill him if he stopped. On another, Sully awoke next to Frank Peasley's ex-wife. She was snoring because her nose was broken. Her pillow was covered with blood, her cheeks covered with blood too, and Sully couldn't remember if he had broken her nose or if fucking Peasley had done it. Sully wanted it to be Peasley, but knew it could have been him. Sometimes, especially in those days, BV, before Viagra, when he failed at sex almost as often as he succeeded, he got mad. Fortunately, when the lady awoke, she couldn't remember either. She remembered what he'd looked like with his underwear off, though. How come you only have one? She'd asked him. I'm lucky to have that, Sully replied. His headache had been bigger than the world. What did I say about the old lady? He asked Diefenbaker as they sat smoking in the alley beside the chapel. Diefenbaker shrugged. Just that you used to see her. He said sometimes she put on different clothes, but it was always her, the old Amazon Nhl24 wasted. I had to shush you up. Fuck, Sully said, and put the hand not holding the cigarette in his hair. You also said it was better once you got back to the East Coast, Diefenbaker said. And look, what's so bad about seeing an old lady once in a while? Some people see flying saucers. Not people who owe two banks almost $1 million, Sully said, if they knew. If they knew what? I'll tell you what, nothing. As long as you keep making the payments, Sully John, keep bringing them that fabled monthly cashew. No one cares what you see when you turn out the light or what you see when you leave it on, for that matter. They don't care if you dress in ladies' underwear, if you beat your wife and hump the Labrador. Besides, don't you think there are guys in those banks who spent time in the green? Sully took a drag on the Dunhill and looked at Diefenbaker. The truth was that he never had considered such a thing. He dealt with two loan officers who were the right age, but they never talked about it. Of course, neither did he. Next time I see them, he thought, I'll have to ask if they carry Zippos, you know. Be subtle. What are you smiling about? Diefenbaker asked. Nothing. What about you, Dief? Do you have an old lady? I don't mean your girlfriend. I mean an old lady and mama's son. Hey, man, don't call me Dief. Nobody calls me that now. I never liked it. Do you have one? Ronnie Malenfont's my mama's son, Diefenbaker said. Sometimes I see him. Not the way you said you see yours, like she's really there, but memory's real too, isn't it? Yeah. Diefenbaker shook his head slowly. If memory was all, if memory was all. Sully sat silent. In the chapel, the organ was now playing something that didn't sound like a hymn, but just music. The recessional, he thought they called it, a musical way of telling the mourners to get lost. Get back, Jojo, your mom is waiting. Diefenbaker said there's memory, and then there's what you actually see in your mind. Like when you read a book by a really good author, and he describes a room and you see that room. I'll be mowing the lawn or sitting at our conference table listening to a story to my grandson before putting him in bed, or maybe even smooching with Mary on the sofa, and boom, there's Nhl24. Got him the acne head with that wavy hair. You remember how his hair used to wave? Yeah. Ronnie Nhl24, always talking about the fucking this and the fucking that and the fucking other thing. Ethnic jokes for every occasion. And the poke. Remember that? Sure. Little leather poke he wore on his belt. He kept his cards in it. 2 decks of bikes. Hey, we're going bitch hunting, boys. Nicola Point, who's up for it? And out they'd come. Yeah. You remember. Remember. But I see him, Sully. Right down to the whiteheads on his chin. I hear him. I can smell the fucking dope he smoked. But mostly, I see him, how he knocked her over and she was lying there on the ground, still shaking her fists at him, still running her mouth. Stop it. And I couldn't believe it was going to happen. At first, I don't think Nhl24 could believe it either. He just jabbed the bandit at her a couple times to begin with, pricking her with the tip of it like the whole thing was a goof. But then he went and he did it. He stuck it in her. Fucking A, so I mean fucking A. She screamed and started jerking all around, and he had his feet, you remember, on either side of her, and the rest of them were running, Ralph Clemson and Mims, and I don't know who else. I always hated that little fuck Clemson, even worse than Nhl24, because at least Ronnie wasn't sneaky. With him, what you saw was what you got. Clemson was crazy and sneaky. I was scared to death, Sully, scared to fucking death. I knew I was supposed to put a stop to it, but I was afraid they'd scrag me if I tried, all of them, all of you. Because at that precise moment, there was all you guys, and then there was me. Sherman, nothing against him. He went into that clearing where the coppers came down like there was no tomorrow. But in that bill, I looked at him, and there was nothing there. He saved my life later on when we got ambushed, so he said quietly. I know. Picked you up and carried you like fucking Superman. He had it in the clearing. He got it back on the trail, but in between, in the Ville, nothing. In the Ville, it was down to me. It was like I was the only grown-up, only I didn't feel like a grown-up. Sully didn't bother telling him to stop again. Diefenbaker meant to have his say. Nothing short of a punch in the mouth would stop him from having it. You remember how she screamed when he stuck it in? That old lady? And Nhl24 standing over her and running his mouth, slope-head this and goop that and slant the other thing. Thank God for Slocum. He looked at me, and that made me do something. Except all I did was tell him to shoot. No, Sully thought. You didn't even do that, Thief. You just nodded your head. If you're in court, they don't let you get away with shit like that. They make you speak out loud. They make you state it for the record. I think Slocum saved our souls that day. Diefenbaker said, you know he offed himself, didn't you? Yeah? In 86? I thought it was a car accident. If driving into a bridge abutment at 70 miles an hour on a clear evening is an accident, it was an accident. What about Nhl24? Any idea? Well, he never came to any of the reunions, of course, but he was alive the last I knew. Andy Brannigan saw him in Southern California. Hedgehog saw him? Yeah, Hedgehog. You know where it was? No, of course not. It's gonna kill you, Sully John. It's gonna blow your mind. Brannigan's In Alcoholics Anonymous. It's his religion. He says it saved his life, and I suppose it did. He used to drink fiercer than any of us, maybe fiercer than all of us put together. So now he's addicted to AA instead of tequila. He goes to about a dozen meetings a week. He's a GSR, don't ask me, some sort of political position in the group. He mans a hotline telephone, and every year he goes to the National Convention. 5 years or so ago, the drunks got together in San Diego. 50,000 alkies all standing in the San Diego Convention Center chanting the Serenity Prayer. Can you picture it? Sorta, Sully said. Fucking Brannigan looks to his left, and who does he see but Ronnie Malenfant? He can hardly believe it, but it's Malenfant, all right. After the big meeting, he grabs Malenfant, and the two of them go out for a drink. Diefenbaker paused. Alcoholics do that too, I guess, lemonades and cokes and such. And Malenfant tells Hedgehog he's almost 2 years clean and sober. He's found a higher power he chooses to call God. He's had a rebirth. Everything is 5 by fucking 5. He's living life on life's terms. He's letting go and letting God, all that stuff they talk in Brannigan. He can't help it. He asks Malenfant if he's taken the 5th step, which is confessing the stuff you've done wrong and becoming entirely ready to make amends. Malenfant doesn't bat an eyelash, just says he took the 5th a year ago and he feels a lot better. Ah, damn, Sully said, surprised at the depth of his anger. Old Mama-san would certainly be glad to know that Ronnie's gotten past it. I'll tell her the next time I see her. Not knowing he would see her later that day, of course. Yeah, you do that. They sat without talking much for a little while. Sully asked Diefenbaker for another cigarette, and Diefenbaker gave him one. Also, another flick of the old Zippo. From around the corner came tangles of conversation and some low laughter. Paggs's funeral was over, and somewhere in California, Ronnie Malenfant was perhaps reading his AA Big Book and getting in touch with that fabled higher power he chose to call God. Maybe Ronnie was also a GSR, whatever the fuck that was. Sully wished Ronnie was dead. Sully wished Ronnie Malenfant had died in a Viet Cong spider hole, his nose full of sores and the smell of rat shit, bleeding internally and puking up chunks of his own stomach lining. Malenfant with his poke and his cards, Malenfant with his bayonet. The old Mama-san in her green pants and orange top and red sneakers. Why were we in Vietnam to begin with? Sully asked, not to get all philosophical or anything, but have you ever figured that out? Who said he who does not learn from the past is condemned to repeat it? Richard Dawson, the host of Family Feud. Fuck you, Sullivan. I don't know who said it. Does it matter? Fucking yeah, Diefenbaker said. Because we never got out. We never got out of the green. Our generation died there. That sounds a little what? A little pretentious? You bet. A little silly? You bet. A little self-regarding? Yes, sir. But that's us. That's us all over. What have we done since NAM, Sully? Those of us who went, those of us who marched and protested, those of us who just sat home watching the Dallas Cowboys and drinking beer and farting into the sofa cushions. Color was seeping into the new lieutenant's cheeks. He had the look of a man who has found his hobby horse and is now climbing on, helpless to do anything but ride. He held up his hands and began popping fingers the way Sully had when talking about the legacies of the Vietnam experience. Well, let's see. We're the generation that invented Super Mario Brothers, the ATV, laser missile guidance systems, and crack cocaine.
We discovered Richard Simmons, Scott Peck, and Martha Stewart living. Our idea of a major lifestyle change is buying a dog. The girls who burned their bras now buy their lingerie from Victoria's Secret, and the boys who fucked fearlessly for peace are now fat guys who sit in front of their computer screens late at night, pulling their puddings while they look at pictures of naked 18-year-olds on the internet. That's us, brother. We like to watch movies, video games, live car chase footage, fist fights on the Jerry Springer Show, Mark McGuire, World Federation Wrestling, impeachment hearings. We don't care. We just like to watch. But there was a time, don't laugh, but there was a time when it was really all in our hands. Do you know that?
Sully nodded, thinking of Carol. Not the version of her sitting on the sofa with him and her wine-smelling mother. Not the one flipping the peace sign at the camera while the blood ran down the side of her face, either. That one was already too late and too crazy. You could see it in her smile, read it in the sign, where screaming words forbade all discussion. Rather, he thought of Carol on the day her mother had taken all of them to Saddle Rock. His friend, Bobby, had won some money from a 3-card Monte dealer that day, and Carol had worn her blue bathing suit on the beach. And sometimes she'd give Bobby that look, the one that said he was killing her, and death was sweet. It had been in their hands then. He was quite sure of it. But kids lose everything. Kids have slippery fingers and holes in their pockets, and they lose everything. We filled up our wallets on the stock market and went to the gym and booked therapy sessions to get in touch with ourselves. South America is burning, Malaysia's burning, fucking Vietnam is burning, but we finally got past that self-hating thing, finally got to like ourselves, so that's okay. Sully thought of Nhl24 getting in touch with himself, learning to like the inner Ronnie, and suppressed a shudder. All of Diefenbaker's fingers were held up in front of his face and poked out. To Sully, he looked like Al Jolson getting ready to sing Mammy. Diefenbaker seemed to become aware of this at the same time Sully did and lowered his hand. He looked tired and distracted and unhappy. I like lots of people our age when they're one by one, he said. But I loathe and despise my generation, Sully. We had an opportunity to change everything. We actually did. Instead, we settled for designer jeans, 2 tickets to Mariah Carey at Radio City Music Hall, frequent flyer miles, James Cameron's Titanic, and retirement portfolios. The only generation even close to us in pure, selfish self-indulgence is the so-called lost generation of the 20s, and at least most of them had the decency to stay drunk. We couldn't even do that, man. We suck. The new lieutenant was close to tears, Sully saw. Steve, you know the price of selling out the future, Sully John? You can never really leave the past. You can never get over. My thesis is that you're really not in New York at all. You're in the Delta, leaning back against a tree, stoned and rubbing bug dope on the back of your neck. Packer's still the man because it's still 1969. Everything you think of as your later life is a big fucking pot bubble. And it's better that way. Vietnam is better. That's why we stay there. You think? Absolutely. dark-haired, brown-eyed woman in a blue dress peeked around the corner and said, "So there you are." Diefenbaker stood up as she came toward them, walking slow and pretty on her high heels. Sully stood up too. "Mary, this is John Sullivan. He served with me in PAGS. Sully, this is my good friend, Mary Teresa Carlton." "Pleased to meet you," Sully said and put out his hand. Her grip was firm and sure, long, cool fingers in his own, but she was looking at Diefenbaker. "Mrs. Pagano wants to see you, hon, please." "You bet," Diefenbaker said. He started toward the front of the building, then turned back to Sully. "Hang in a little bit," he said. "We'll go for a drink. I promise not to preach." But his eyes shifted from Sully's when he said this, as if they knew it was a promise he couldn't keep. "Thanks, Lute, but I really ought to get back. I want to beat the rush hour traffic." But he hadn't beaten the traffic after all. And now a piano was falling toward him, gleaming in the sun and humming to itself as it came. Sully fell flat on his stomach and rolled under a car. The piano came down less than 5 feet away, detonating and throwing up rows of keys like teeth. Sully slid back out from beneath the car, burning his back on the hot tailpipe and struggling to his feet. He looked north along the turnpike, eyes wide and unbelieving. A vast rummage sale was falling out of the sky. Tape recorders and rugs and a riding lawnmower with the grass-caked blade whirling in its housing, and a black lawn jockey and an aquarium with the fish still swimming in it. He saw an old man with a lot of theatrical gray hair running up the breakdown lane, and then a flight of steps fell on him, tearing off his left arm and sending him to his knees. There were clocks and desks and coffee tables and a plummeting elevator with its cable uncoiling into the air behind it like a greasy, severed umbilicus. A squall of ledgers fell in the parking lot of a nearby industrial complex. Their clapping covers sounded like applause. A fur coat fell on a running woman, trapping her, and then a sofa landed on her, crushing her. The air filled with a storm of light as large panes of greenhouse glass dropped out of the blue. A statue of a Civil War soldier smashed through a panel truck. An ironing board hit the railing of the overpass up ahead and then fell into the stalled traffic below like a spinning propeller. A stuffed lion dropped into the back of a pickup truck. Everywhere were running, screaming people. Everywhere were cars with dented roofs and smashed windows. Sully saw a Mercedes with the unnaturally pink legs of a department store mannequin sticking up from the sunroof. The air shook with whines and whistles. Another shadow fell on him, and even as he ducked and raised his hand, he knew it was too late. If it was an iron or a toaster or something like that, it would fracture his skull. If it was something bigger, he'd be nothing but a grease spot on the highway. The falling object struck his hand without hurting it in the slightest, bounced, and landed at his feet. He looked down at it first with surprise, then with dawning wonder. "Holy shit," he said. Sully bent over and picked up the baseball glove which had fallen from the sky, recognizing it at once, even after all these years. The deep scratch down the last finger and the comically tangled knots and the rawhide laces of the webbing were as good as fingerprints. He looked on the side where Bobby had printed his name. It was still there, but the letters looked fresher than they should have. And the leather here looked frayed and faded and whipsawed, as if other names had been inked in the same spot and then erased. Closer to his face, the smell of the glove was both intoxicating and irresistible. Sully slipped it onto his hand, and when he did, something crackled beneath his little finger, a piece of paper shoved in there. He paid no attention. Instead, he put the glove over his face, closed his eyes, and inhaled. Leather and neat's foot oil and sweat and grass. All the summers that were. The summer of 1960, for instance, when he had come back from his week at camp to find everything changed. Bobby sullen, Carol distant and palely thoughtful, at least for a while. And the cool old guy who had lived on the third floor of Bobby's building, Ted, gone. Everything had changed, but it was still summer. He had still been 11, and everything had still seemed eternal. He murmured into the glove and inhaled deeply of its aroma again as nearby a glass case filled with butterflies shattered on the roof of a bread van, and a stop sign stuck quivering into the breakdown lane like a thrown spear. Sully remembered his bolo bouncer and his black kids and the taste of piz straight out of the gun, how the pieces of candy would hit the roof of your mouth and then ricochet onto your tongue. He remembered the way his catcher's mask felt when it sat on his face just right, and the of the lawn sprinklers on Broad Street, and how mad Mrs. Cunn got if you walked too close to her precious flowers, and Mrs. Godlow at the Asher Empire wanting to see your birth certificate if she thought you were too big to be still under 12, and the poster Bridget Bardot, if she's trash, I'd love to be the trash man, and her towel, and playing guns, and playing pass, and playing careers, and making arm farts in the back of Mrs. Sweetzer's 4th grade classroom, and hey, American. And Sully knew who he was going to see even before he raised his head from Bobby's Alvin dark model glove. It was old Mama San, standing there between the crotch rocket, which had been crushed by a freezer. Wrapped meat was spilling out of its shattered door in frosty blocks, and a Subaru with a lawn flamingo punched through its roof. Old Mama San in her green pants and orange smock and red sneakers. Old Mama San, lit up like a bar sign in hell. Hey, American, you come me. I keep safe. And she held out her arms. Sully walked toward her through the noisy hail of falling televisions and backyard pools and cartons of cigarettes and high-heeled shoes and a great big pole hair dryer and a pay telephone that hit and vomited a jackpot of quarters. He walked toward her with a feeling of relief, that feeling you get only when you are coming home. I keep safe, holding out her arms now. Poor boy, I keep safe. Sully stepped into the dead circle of her embrace as people screamed and ran, and all things American fell out of the sky, blitzing I-95 north of Bridgeport with their falling glitter. She put her arms around him. I keep safe, she said, and Sully was in his car. Traffic was stopped all around him, 4 lanes of it. The radio was on, tuned to WKND. The Platters were singing Twilight Time. And Sully couldn't breathe. Nothing appeared to have fallen out of the sky. Except for the traffic tie-up, everything seemed to be in good order. But how could that be? How could it be when he still had Bobby Garfield's old baseball glove on his hand? I keep safe, old Mama San was saying. Poor boy, poor American boy, I keep safe. Sully couldn't breathe. He wanted to smile at her. He wanted to tell her he was sorry, that some of them had at least meant well, but he had no air, and he was very tired. He closed his eyes and tried to raise Bobby's glove one final time, get One final shallow whiff of that oily, summery smell. But it was too heavy.
Almost made me cry, man. Mama son.
Diefenbaker was standing at the kitchen counter the next morning, wearing a pair of jeans and nothing else, pouring himself a cup of coffee when Mary came in from the living room. She was wearing her property of the Denver Broncos sweatshirt and had the New York Post in her hand. "I think I have some bad news for you," she said, then seemed to reconsider. "Moderately bad news." He turned to her warily. Bad news should always come after lunch, he thought. At least a person was halfway prepared for bad news after lunch. First thing in the morning, everything left a bruise. "What is it?" "The man you introduced me to yesterday at your buddy's funeral, you said he was a car dealer in Connecticut, right?" "Right." "I wanted to be sure because John Sullivan isn't, the world's most striking and uncommon." "What are you talking about, Mary?" She handed him the paper, which was folded open to a page about halfway into the tabloid. "They say it happened while he was on his way home." "I'm sorry, hon." She had to be wrong. That was his first thought. People couldn't die just after you'd seen them and talked to them. It seemed like a basic rule somehow. But it was him, all right, and in triplicate. Sully, in a high school baseball uniform, with a catcher's mask pushed back to the top of his head. Sully, in an army uniform with sergeant stripes on the sleeve, and Sully in a business suit that had to hail from the late 70s. Beneath the row of pictures was the sort of headline you found only in the Post. "Jambo! Silver Star Viet Det dies in Cannes traffic jam." Diefenbaker scanned the story quickly, feeling the sense of unease and betrayal he always felt these days when he read the death notice of someone his own age, someone he knew. "We are still too young for natural deaths," he always thought, knowing that it was a foolish idea. Sully had died of an apparent heart attack while stuck in a traffic tie-up caused by a jackknifed tractor-trailer truck. He might well have died within sight of his own dealership's Chevrolet sign, the article lamented. Like the Jambo headline, such epiphanies could be found only in the Post. The Times was a good paper if you were smart. The Post was the newspaper of drunks and poets. Sully had left an ex-wife and no children. Funeral arrangements were being made by Norman Oliver of First Connecticut Bank and Trust, buried by his bank. Diefenbaker thought, his hands beginning to shake. He had no idea why this thought filled him with such horror, but it did. By his fucking bank? Oh, man. "Honey?" Mary was looking at him a little nervously. "Are you all right?" "Yes," he said. "He died in a traffic jam. Maybe they couldn't even get an ambulance to him. Maybe they never even found him until the traffic started moving again." "Christ." "Don't," she said, and took the paper away from him again. Sully had won the Silver Star for the rescue, of course, the helicopter rescue. The Gooks had been shooting, but Packer and Sherman had let a bunch of American soldiers, mostly Delta 22s, in just the same. 10 or 12 of the Bravo Company soldiers had laid down a confused and probably not very effective covering fire as the rescue operation took place, and for a wonder, 2 of the men from the Tangled copters had actually been alive, at least when they came out of the clearing. John Sullivan had carried one of them to cover, all by himself, the chopper guy shrieking in his arms and covered with fire-retardant foam. Malenfant had gone running into the clearing, too. Malenfant clutching one of the extinguisher canisters like a big red baby and screaming at the Kong in the bush to shoot him if they could, except they couldn't. He knew they couldn't. They were just a bunch of blind, slow-pedged, syphilitic fucks, and they couldn't hit him, couldn't hit the broadside of a fucking barn. Malenfant had also been put up for the Silver Star, and although Diefenbaker couldn't say for sure, he supposed the pimply little murdering asshole had probably won one. Had Sully known? or guest? Wouldn't he have mentioned it while they were sitting together outside the funeral parlor? Maybe, maybe not. Medals had a way of seeming less important as time passed, more and more like the award you get in junior high for memorizing a poem, or the letter you got in high school for running track and blocking home plate when the throw came home. Just something you kept on a shelf. They were the things old men used to jazz the kids, the things they held out to make you jump higher, run faster, fling yourself forward. Diefenbaker thought the world would probably be a better place without old men. This revelation coming just as he was getting ready to be one himself. Let the old women live. Old women never hurt anyone, as a rule. But old men were more dangerous than rabid dogs. Shoot all of them, then douse their bodies with gasoline and light them on fire. Let the children join hands and dance around the blaze, singing corny old Crosby, Stills, and Nash songs. Are you really okay? Mary asked. About Sully? Sure, I hadn't seen him in years. He sipped his coffee and thought about the old lady in the red sneakers, the one Nhl24 had killed, the one who came to visit Sully. She wouldn't be visiting Sully anymore. There was that much at least. Old Mama San's visiting days were done. It was how wars really ended, Diefenbaker supposed, not at truce tables, but in cancer wards and office cafeterias and traffic jams. Wars died one tiny piece at a time, each piece something that fell like a memory, each lost like an echo that fades in winding hills. In the end, even war ran up the white flag, or so he hoped. He hoped that in the end, even war surrendered. $19.99. Come on, you bastard. Come on home. Heavenly shades of night are falling. On an afternoon in the last summer before the year 2000, Bobby Garfield came back to Harwich, Connecticut. He went to West Side Cemetery first, where the actual memorial service took place at the Sullivan family plot. Old Sully John got a good crowd. The Post story brought them out in droves. Several small children were startled into tears when the American Legion Honor Guard fired their guns. After the graveside service, there was a reception at the local AMVETS Hall. Bobby made a token appearance, long enough to have a slice of cake and a cup of coffee and say hello to Mr. Oliver. But he saw no one he knew, and there were places he wanted to go while there was still plenty of good daylight. He hadn't been back to Harwich in almost 40 years. The Nutmeg Mall stood where St. Gabriel the Steadfast upper and secondary schools had been. The old post office was now a vacant lot. The railway station continued to overlook the square, but the stone overpass support posts were covered with graffiti, and Mr. Burton's newsstand kiosk was boarded up. There were still grassy swards between River Avenue and the Housatonic, but the ducks were gone. Bobby remembered throwing one of those ducks at a man in a tan suit. Improbable but true. "I'll give you $2 to let me blow you," the man had said, and Bobby had hucked a duck at him. He could grin about it now, but that Nimrod had scared the hell out of him, and for all sorts of reasons. There was a great beige UPS warehouse where the Asher Empire had stood. Farther along toward Bridgeport, where Asher Avenue emptied into Puritan Square, the William Penn Grill was also gone, replaced by a Pizza Uno. Bobby thought about going in there, but not very seriously. His stomach was 50, just like the rest of him, and it didn't do so well with pizza anymore. Except that wasn't really the reason. It would be too easy to imagine things. That was the real reason. Too easy to envision big, vulgar cars out front. The paint jobs so bright they seemed to howl. So he had driven back to Harwich proper, and damned if the Colony Diner wasn't still where it had always been, and damned if there weren't still grilled hot dogs on the menu. Hot dogs were as bad as fucking pizza, maybe worse, but what the hell was Prilosec for, if not the occasional gastronomic ramble down memory lane? He had swallowed one and chased it with 2 hot dogs. They still came in those little grease-spotted cardboard sleeves, and they still tasted like heaven. He tamped the hot dogs down with pie a la mode, then went out and stood by his car for a moment. He decided to leave it where it was. There were only 2 more stops he wanted to make, and both were within walking distance. He took the gym bag off the passenger seat and walked slowly past Spicer's, which had evolved into a 7-Eleven store with gas pumps out front. Voices came to him as he passed. 1960 ghost voices. Voices of the Sigsbee twins. Mommy, Daddy having a fight. Mama said stay out. Why'd you do that, stupid old Bobby Garfield? Stupid old Bobby Garfield, yes, that had been him. He might have gotten a little smarter over the years, but probably not that much. Halfway up Broad Street Hill, he spied a faded hopscotch grid on the sidewalk. He dropped to one knee and looked at it closely in the lightening light, brushing at the squares with the tips of his fingers. Mister, you all right? It was a young woman with a 7-Eleven bag in her arms. She was looking at Bobby with equal parts concern and mistrust. I'm fine, he said, getting to his feet and dusting off his hands. He was, too. Not a single moon or star beside the grid, let alone a comet. Nor had he seen any lost pet posters in his rambles around town. I'm fine. Well, good for you, the young woman said and hurried on her way. She did not smile. Bobby watched her go and then started walking again himself, wondering what had happened to the Sigsbee twins, where they were now. He remembered Ted Brodigan talking about time was calling it the old bald cheater. Until he actually saw 149 Broad Street, Bobby hadn't realized how sure he'd been that it would have become a video rental store or a sandwich shop or maybe a condominium. Instead, it was exactly the same, except for the trim, now cream instead of green. There was a bike on the porch, and he thought of how desperately he had wanted a bike that last summer in Harwich. He'd even had a jar to save money in with a label on it that said bike account or something. More ghost voices as he stood there with his shadow lengthening into the street. If we were the Gotrocks, you wouldn't have to borrow from your bike jar if you wanted to take your little girlfriend on the loop-de-loop. She's not my girlfriend. She's not my little girlfriend. In his memory, he had said that out loud to his mother, screamed it at her, in fact, but he doubted the accuracy of that memory. He hadn't had the kind of mother you could scream at. Not if you wanted to keep your scalp. And besides, Carol had been his little girlfriend, hadn't she? She had been. He had one more stop to make before returning to his car, and after a final long look at the house where he had lived with his mother until August of 1960, Bobby started back down Broad Street Hill, swinging the gym bag in one hand. There had been magic that summer. Even at the age of 50, he did not question that. But he no longer knew of what sort it had been. Perhaps he had only experienced the Ray Bradbury kind of childhood so many small-town kids had, or at least remembered having, the kind where the real world and that of dreams sometimes overlapped, creating a kind of magic. Yes, but, well, there were the rose petals, of course, the ones which had come by way of Carol. But had they meant anything? Once it had seemed so. To the lonely, almost lost boy he had been, it had seemed so. But the rose petals were long gone. He had lost them right around the time he'd seen the photograph of that burned-out house in Los Angeles and realized that Carol Gerber was dead. Her death canceled not only the idea of magic, but, it seemed to Bobby, the very purpose of childhood. What good was it if it brought you to such things? Bad eyes and bad blood pressure were one thing. Bad ideas, bad dreams, and bad ends were another. After a while, you wanted to say to God, "Oh, come on, big boy, quit it." You lost your innocence when you grew up, all right, everyone knew that. But did you have to lose your hope as well? What good was it to kiss a girl on the Ferris wheel when you were 11, if you were to open the paper 11 years later and learn that she had burned to death in a slummy little house on a slummy little dead-end street? What good was it to remember her beautiful, alarmed eyes or the way the sun had shone in her hair? He would have said all of this, and more, a week ago. But then, a tendril of that old magic had reached out and touched him. "Come on," it had whispered. "Come on, Bobby. Come on, you bastard. Come home." So here he was, back in Harwich. He had honored his old friend. He had had himself a little sightseeing tour of the old town, and without misting up a single time. And now it was almost time to go. He had, however, one more stop to make before he did. It was the supper hour, and Commonwealth Park was nearly empty. Bobby walked to the wire backstop behind the Field B home plate, as 3 dawdling players went past him in the other direction. 2 were carrying equipment in big red duffel bags. The third had a boombox from which the Offspring blasted at top volume. All 3 boys gave him mistrustful looks, which Bobby found unsurprising. He was an adult in the land of children, living in a time when all such as he were suspect. He avoided making things worse by giving them a nod or a wave or saying something stupid like, "How is the gang, fellas?" They passed on their way. He stood with his fingers hooked in the wire diamonds of the backstop, watching the late red light slant across the outfield grass, reflecting from the scoreboard and the signs reading, "Stay in school," and "Why do you think they call it dope?" And again he felt that breathless sense of magic, that sense of the world as a thin veneer stretched over something else, something both brighter and darker. The voices were everywhere now, spinning like the lines on a top. "Don't you call me stupid, Bobby-o." "You shouldn't hit Bobby. He's not like those men." "A real sweetie kid. he'd play that song by Joe Stafford. It's Ka, and Ka is destiny. I love you, Ted. I love you, Ted. Bobby spoke the words, not declaiming them, but not whispering them either. Trying them on for size. He couldn't even remember what Ted Brodigan had looked like. Not with any real clarity. Only the Chesterfields and the endless bottles of root beer. But saying it still made him feel warm. There was another voice here, too. When it spoke, Bobby felt tears sting the corners of his eyes for the first time since coming back. I wouldn't mind being a magician when I grew up, Bobby, you know it? Travel around with a carnival or a circus, wear a black suit and a top hat, pull rabbits and shit out of the hat, Bobby said, turning away from Field B. He laughed, wiped his eyes, and then ran one hand over the top of his head. No hair up there. He'd lost the last of it right on schedule about 15 years ago. He crossed one of the paths, gravel in 1960, now asphalt and marked with little signs reading, "Bikes only, no rollerblades," and sat down on one of the benches, possibly the same one where he'd sat on the day Sully had asked him to come to the movies and Bobby had turned him down, wanting to finish Lord of the Flies instead. He put his gym bag on the bench next to him. Directly ahead was a grove of trees. Bobby was pretty sure it was the one where Carol had taken him when he started to cry. She did it so no one would see him, bawling like a baby, no one but her. Had she taken him in her arms until it was cried out of him? He wasn't sure, but he thought she had. What he remembered more clearly was how the three St. Gabe's boys had almost beaten them up later. Carol's mother's friend had saved them. He couldn't remember her name, but she'd come along just in the nick of time, the way the Navy guy came along just in time to say Ralph's bacon at the end of Lord of the Flies. Rianda! That was her name. She told them she'd tell the priest, and the priest would tell their folks. But Rianda hadn't been around when those boys found Carol again. Would Carol have burned to death in Los Angeles? If Harry Doolin and his friends had left her alone? You couldn't say for sure, of course, but Bobby thought the answer was probably no. And even now he felt his hands clenching as he thought, but I got you, Harry, didn't I? Yes, indeed. Too late by then, though. By then, everything had changed. He unzipped the gym bag, rummaged, and brought out a battery radio. It was nowhere as big as the boombox, which had just gone past him toward the equipment sheds, but big enough for his purposes. All he had to do was turn it on. It was already tuned to WKND, Southern Connecticut's home of the oldies. Troy Shondell was singing This Time, and that was fine with Bobby. "Sully," he said, looking into the grove of trees, "you were one cool bastard." From behind him, very prim, a woman said, "If you swear, I won't walk with you." Bobby swiveled around so rapidly that the radio fell out of his lap and tumbled into the grass. He couldn't see the woman's face. She was nothing but a silhouette with red sky spread out on either side of her like wings. He tried to speak and couldn't. His breathing had come to a dead stop and his tongue was stuck to the roof of his mouth. Far back in his brain, a voice mused, "So this is what seeing a ghost is like." "Bobby, are you all right?" She moved fast, coming around the bench, and the red setting sun smacked him full in the eyes when she did. Bobby gasped, raised a hand, and shut his eyes. He He smelled perfume, or was it summer grass? He didn't know. And when he opened his eyes again, he could still see nothing but the woman's shape. There was a hanging green after-image of the sun where her face belonged. "Carol?" he asked. His voice was hoarse and uneven. "Dear God, is it really you?" "Carol?" the woman asked. "I don't know any Carol. My name is Denise Schoonover." Yet it was her. She'd only been 11 the last time he had seen her, but he knew. He rubbed his eyes frantically. From the radio on the grass, the DJ said, "This is WKND, where your past is always present. Here's Clyde McFadder. He's got a lover's question." You knew if she was alive, she'd come. You knew that. Of course. Wasn't that why he had come himself? Surely not for Sully, or not just for Sully. And yet at the same time he had been so sure she was dead. From the instant he'd seen the picture of that burned-out house in Los Angeles, he had been positive. And how that had hurt his heart. Not as if he'd last seen her 40 years before, running across Commonwealth Avenue, but as if she had always remained his friend, as close as a phone call or a trip up the street. While he was still trying to blink away the floating sunspot after-image hanging before his eyes, the woman kissed him firmly on the mouth, and then whispered in his ear, "I have to go home. I have to make the salad." "What's that?" "The last thing you ever said to me when we were kids," he replied, and turned to her. "You came. You're alive. And you came." The sunset light fell on her face, and the after-image had diminished enough for him to see her. She was beautiful, in spite of the scar which began at the corner of her right eye and ran down to her chin, a cruel fishhook, or perhaps because of it. There were tiny sprays of crow's feet beside her eyes, but no lines on her forehead or bracketing her paintless mouth. Her hair, Bobby saw with wonder, was almost entirely gray. As if reading his mind, she reached out and touched his head. "I'm so sorry," she said. And he thought he saw her old merriness dancing in her eyes. "You had the most gorgeous hair. Rihanna used to say that was half of what I was in love with." "Carol." She reached out and put her fingers over his lips. There were scars on her hand as well, Bobby saw, and her little finger was misshapen, almost melted. These were burn scars. "I told you I don't know anyone named Carol. My name is Denise. Like in the old Randy and the Rainbows song?" She hummed a snatch of it. Bobby knew it well. He knew all the oldies. "If you were to check my ID, you'd see Denise Schoonover all up and down the line. I saw you at the service." "I didn't see you." "I'm good at not being seen," she said. "It's a trick someone taught me a long time ago. The trick of being dim." She shuddered a little. Bobby had read of people shuddering, mostly in bad novels, but had never actually seen it done. "And when it comes to crowd scenes, I'm good at standing all the way at the back." Poor old Sully John. "Do you remember his bolo bouncer?" Bobby nodded, starting to smile. "I remember one time when he tried to get extra cool with it, hit it between his legs as well as between his arms and behind his back. He bopped himself a good one in the balls, and we all just about killed ourselves laughing. A bunch of girls ran over. You were one of them, I'm pretty sure. Wanting to know what happened, we wouldn't tell you. You were pretty mad." She smiled, a hand going to her mouth. And in that old gesture, Bobby could see the child she had been with complete clarity. "How'd you know he died?" Bobby asked. "Read it in the New York Post. It was one of those horrible headlines that are their specialty. Jambo, it said, and pictures of him. I live in Poughkeepsie, where the Post is regularly available." She paused. "I teach at Vassar." "You teach at Vassar and you read the Post?" She shrugged, smiling. Everyone has their vices. How about you, Bobby? Did you read it in the Post? I don't get the Post. Ted told me. Ted Brodigan. She only sat there looking at him, her smile fading. You remember Ted? I thought I'd never be able to use my arm again, and Ted fixed it like magic. Of course I remember him. But Bobby, he knew you'd be here. I thought that as soon as I opened the package, but I don't think I believed it until I saw you. He reached out to her, and with the unself-consciousness of a child, traced the course of the scar on her face. You got this in L.A., didn't you? What happened? How'd you get out? She shook her head. I don't talk about any of that. I've never talked about what went on in that house. I never will. That was a different life. That was a different girl. That girl died. She was very young, very idealistic, and she was tricked. Do you remember the Monty man at Savin Rock? He nodded, smiling a little. He took her hand and she gripped his own tightly. Now they go, now they slow, now they rest, here's the test. His name was McCann or Coughlin or something like that. The name doesn't matter. What matters is that he always let you think you knew where the queen was. He always let you think you could win. Right? Right. This girl got involved with a man like that. A man who could always move the cards just a little faster than you thought he could. He was looking for some confused, angry kids, and he found them. Did he have a yellow coat? Bobby asked. He didn't know if he was joking or not. She looked at him, frowning a little, and he understood she didn't remember that part. Had he even told her about the low men? He thought so. He thought he'd told her just about everything, but she didn't remember. Perhaps what had happened to her in L.A. had burned a few holes in her memory. Bobby could see how a thing like that might happen. And it wouldn't exactly make her unique, would it? A lot of people their age had worked very hard to forget who they had been and what they had believed during those years between the murder of John Kennedy in Dallas and the murder of John Lennon in New York City. Never mind, he said. Go on. She shook her head. I've said all I'm going to about that part, all I can. Carol Gerber died on Benefit Street in Los Angeles. Denise Schoonover lives in Poughkeepsie. Carol hated math. Couldn't even get fractions, but Denise teaches math. How could they be the same person? It's a ridiculous idea. Case closed. I want to know what you mean about Ted. He can't still be alive, Bobby. He'd be over 100, well over. I don't think time means much if you're a breaker, Bobby said. Nor did it mean much on WKND, where Jimmy Gilmer was now singing about the Sugar Shack to the tooting accompaniment of what sounded like a sweet potato. A breaker? I don't know, and it doesn't matter, Bobby said. This part might, so listen closely, okay? Okay. I live in Philadelphia. I've got a lovely wife who's a professional photographer, 3 lovely grown children, a lovely old dog with bad hips and a good disposition, and an old house which is always in desperate need of repairs. My wife says that's because the shoemaker's kids always go barefoot, and the carpenter's house always has a leaky roof. Is that what you are, a carpenter? He nodded. I live in Redmond Hills, and when I remember to get a paper, the Philly Inquirer is the one I buy. A carpenter, she mused. I always thought you'd wind up a writer or something. I did too. But I also went through a period when I thought I'd wind up in Connecticut State Prison, and that never happened, so I guess things have a way of balancing out. What was in the package you mentioned, and what does it have to do with Ted? The package came FedEx from a guy named Norman Oliver, a banker. He was Sully John's executor. This was inside. He reached into the gym bag again and brought out a battered old baseball glove. He laid it in the lap of the woman. She tipped it at once and looked at the name inked on the side. "My God," she said. Her voice was flat, shocked. "I haven't seen this baby since the day I found you over there in those trees with your arm dislocated. I suppose some kid came along, saw it lying on the grass, and just gleeped it, although it wasn't in very good shape even then." "Willie stole it," she said, almost inaudibly. "Willie Sherman. I thought he was nice. You see what a fool I was about people, even back then?" He looked at her in silent surprise, but she didn't see his look. She was gazing down at the old Alvin dark model glove, plucking at the tangle of rawhide strings, somehow still holding the webbing in place. And then she delighted and touched him by doing what he had done. As soon as he opened the box and saw what was there, she lifted the baseball glove to her face and smelled the sweet oil and leather aroma of the pocket. Only he had slipped it on his hand first, without even thinking about it. It was a baseball player thing to do, and a kid thing. Automatic as breathing. Norman Oliver must have been a kid at some point, but he'd apparently never been a ball player because he hadn't found the piece of paper. Poked deep into the last finger of the glove, the finger with the deep scratch in the old cowhide. Bobby was the one who found the paper. The nail of his little finger poked against it and made it crackle. Carol put the glove down again. Gray hair or no gray hair, she looked young again and fully alive. "Tell me." "It was on Sully's hand when they found him sitting dead in his car." Her eyes went huge and round. In that instant, she did not just look like the little girl who had ridden the Ferris wheel with him at Savin Rock. She was that little girl. "Look on the heel of the glove there by Alvin Dark's signature. Do you see?" The light was fading fast now, but she saw all right. "B.G. 1464 DuPont Circle Road, Redmond Hills, Pennsylvania, Zone 11. "Your address," she murmured. "Your address now?" "Yes, but look at this." He tapped the words Zone 11. "The post office quit zoning mail in the 60s. I checked. Ted either didn't know or forgot. Maybe he put it that way on purpose." Bobby nodded. "It's possible. In any case, Oliver read the address and sent me the glove. Said he saw no need to put an old fielder's mitt through probate. He mostly wanted me to know that Sully had died, if I didn't know already. And if there was going to be a memorial service in Harwich, I believe he wanted me to come so he could hear the story of the glove. I couldn't help him much with that, though." "Carol, are you sure Willie—" "I saw him wearing it. I told him to give it back so I could send it to you, but he wouldn't." "You suppose he gave it to Sully John later?" "He must have." Yet it did not ring true to her, somehow. She felt the truth must be stranger than that. Willie's attitude to the glove itself had been strange, although she could no longer exactly remember how. "Anyway," he said, tapping the address on the heel of the glove, "that's Ted's printing, I'm sure it is." Then I put my hand up inside the glove and I found something. It's really why I came. He reached into the gym bag a third time. The redness was going out of the light now. The remains of the day were a fading pink, the color of wild roses. The radio, still lying in the grass, played "Don't You Just Know It" by Huey Piano Smith and the Clowns. Bobby brought out a crumpled piece of paper. It had been stained in a couple of places by the glove's sweaty innards, but otherwise it looked remarkably white and fresh. He handed it to Carol. She held it up to the light and slightly away from her face. Her eyes, Bobby saw, were not as good as they once had been. It's the title page from a book, she said, and then laughed. Lord of the Flies? Bobby, your favorite. Look at the bottom, he said. Read what's there. Faber and Faber Limited, 24 Russell Square, London. She looked at him questioningly. It's from the Faber paperback edition published in 1960, Bobby said. That's on the back, but look at it, Carol. It looks brand new. I think the book this page came from might have been in 1960, only weeks ago. Not the glove, that's a lot more beat up than when I found it, but the title page. Bobby, not all old books turn yellow if they're kept well. Even an old paperback might turn it over, he said. Take a look at the other side. Carol did. Printed below the line, reading "All rights reserved," was this. Tell her she was as brave as a lion. That's when I knew I had to come, because he thought you'd be here. That you were still alive. I couldn't believe that. It was easier to believe in him than it was to believe. Carol, what's wrong? Is it the thing at the very bottom? What is that thing at the very bottom? She was crying now, and crying hard, holding the torn-out title page in her hand and looking at what had been placed there on the back, squeezed into the scant white space below the conditions of sale. Hand-drawn in the familiar symbols, a formula. Love plus peace equals information. What does it mean? Do you know? You do, don't you? Carol shook her head. It doesn't matter. It's special to me, that's all. Special to me the way the glove is special to you. For an old guy, he sure knows how to push the right buttons, doesn't he? I guess so. Maybe that's what a breaker does. She looked at him. She was still weeping, but was not, Bobby thought, truly unhappy. Bobby, why would he do this? And how did he know we'd come? 40 years is a long time. People grow up. They grow up and leave the kids they were behind. Do they? She continued to look at him in the darkening day. Beyond them, the shadows of the grove deepened. In there, in the trees where he had wept on one day and found her hurt and alone the next, dark had almost come. Sometimes a little of the magic sticks around, Bobby said. That's what I think. We came because we still hear some of the right voices. You hear them? The voices? Sometimes, she said almost reluctantly. Sometimes I do. Bobby took the glove from her. Will you excuse me for a second? Sure. Bobby went to the grove of trees. Dropped down on one knee to get beneath a low-hanging branch and placed his old baseball glove on the grass with the pocket up to the darkening sky. Then he came back to the bench and sat down beside Carol again. That's where it belongs, he said. Some kid will just come along tomorrow and pick it up. You know that, don't you? She laughed and wiped her eyes. Maybe, he agreed, or maybe it'll be gone. Back to wherever it came from. As the day's last pink faded to ash, she put her head on his shoulder, and he put an arm around her. They sat that way without speaking, and from the radio at their feet, the platters began to sing.
Heavenly shades of light are falling. It's
Read by Stephen Weber.
This book is gratefully dedicated to my children. My mother and my wife taught me how to be a man. My children taught me how to be free. Naomi Rachel King at 14. Joseph Hillstrom King at 12. Owen Philip King at 7. Kids, fiction is the truth inside the lie, and the truth of this fiction is simple enough. The magic exists. S.K. This old town been home long as I remember. This town gonna be here long after I'm gone. East side, west side, take a close look round her. You've been down, but you're still in my bones. The Michael Stanley Band. Old friend, what are you looking for? After those many years abroad, you come with images you tended under foreign skies far away from your own land. George Seferis. Out of the blue and into the black. Neil Young. Part 1. The Shadow Before. They begin. The perfections are sharpened. The flower spreads its colored petals wide in the sun. But the tongue of the bee misses them. They sink back into the loam, crying out. You may call it a cry that creeps over them, a shiver as they wilt and disappear. William Carlos Williams, Patterson. Born down in a dead man's town. Bruce Springsteen. Chapter 1. After the Flood, 1957. 1. The terror, which would not end for another 28 years, if it ever did end, began, so far as I know or can tell, with a boat made from a sheet of newspaper floating down a gutter swollen with rain. The boat bobbed, listed, righted itself again, dived bravely through treacherous whirlpools, and continued on its way down Witcham Street toward the traffic light, which marked the intersection of Witcham and Jackson. The 3 vertical lenses on all sides of the traffic light were dark this afternoon in the fall of 1957. And the houses were all dark, too. There had been steady rain for a week now, and 2 days ago the winds had come as well. Most sections of Derry had lost their power then, and it was not back on yet. A small boy in a yellow slicker and red galoshes ran cheerfully along beside the newspaper boat. The rain had not stopped, but it was finally slackening. It tapped on the yellow hood of the boy's slicker, sounding to his ears like rain on a shed roof, a comfortable, almost cozy sound. The boy in the yellow slicker was George Denbrough. He was 6. His brother William, known to most of the kids at Derry Elementary School, and even to the teachers, who would never have used the nickname to his face, as Stuttering Bill, was at home hacking out the last of a nasty case of influenza. In that autumn of 1957, 8 months before the real horrors began, and 28 years before the final showdown, Stuttering Bill was 10 years old. Bill had made the boat beside which George ran now. He had made it sitting up in bed, his back propped against a pile of pillows, while their mother played Für Elisa on the piano in the parlor, and rain swept restlessly against his bedroom window. About 3/4 of the way down the block, as one headed toward the intersection and the dead traffic light, Witcham Street was blocked to motor traffic by smudge pots and 4 orange sawhorses. Stenciled across each of the horses was Derry Department of Public Works. Beyond them, the rain had spilled out of gutters clogged with branches and rocks and big sticky piles of autumn leaves. The water had first pried fingerholds in the paving, and then snatched whole greedy handfuls. All of this by the 3rd day of the rains. By noon of the 4th day, Big chunks of the street's surface were boating through the intersection of Jackson and Witcham like miniature whitewater rafts. By that time, many people in Derry had begun to make nervous jokes about arcs. The Public Works Department had managed to keep Jackson Street open, but Witcham was impassable from the Sawhorses all the way to the center of town. But everyone agreed the worst was over. The Kenduskeag stream had crested just below its banks in the Barrens, and bare inches below the concrete sides of the canal, which channeled it tightly as it passed through downtown. Right now, a gang of men, Zach Dembro, George's and Bill's father among them, were removing the sandbags they had thrown up the day before with such panicky haste. Yesterday, overflow and expensive flood damage had seemed almost inevitable. God knew it had happened before. The flooding in 1931 had been a disaster, which had cost millions of dollars and almost 24 lives. That was a long time ago, but there were still enough people around who remembered it to scare the rest. One of the flood victims had been found 25 miles east, in Bucksport. The fish had eaten this unfortunate gentleman's eyes, 3 of his fingers, his penis, and most of his left foot. Clutched in what remained of his hands had been a Ford steering wheel. Now, though, the river was receding, and when the new Bangor Hydro Dam went in upstream, the river would cease to be a threat. Or so said Zach Dembro, who worked for Bangor Hydroelectric. As for the rest, well, future floods could take care of themselves. The thing was to get through this one, to get the power back on, and to forget it. In Derry, such forgetting of tragedy and disaster was almost an art, as Bill Denbrough would come to discover in the course of time. George paused, just beyond the Sawhorses at the edge of a deep ravine that had been cut through the tar surface of Witcham Street. This ravine ran on an almost exact diagonal. It ended on the far side of the street, roughly 40 feet farther down the hill from where he now stood, on the right. He laughed aloud, the sound of solitary, childish glee, a bright runner in that gray afternoon, as a vagary of the flowing water took his paper boat into a scale model rapids, which had been formed by the break in the tar. The urgent water had cut a channel which ran along the diagonal, and so his boat traveled from one side of Witcham Street to the other, the current carrying it so fast that George had to sprint to keep up with it. Water sprayed out from beneath his galoshes in muddy sheets. Their buckles made a jolly jingling as George Dembro ran toward his strange death. And the feeling which filled him at that moment was clear and simple love for his brother Bill. Love and a touch of regret that Bill couldn't be here to see this and be a part of it. Of course, he would try to describe it to Bill when he got home, but he knew he wouldn't be able to make Bill see it, the way Bill would have been able to make him see it if their positions had been reversed. Bill was good at reading and writing, but even at his age, George was wise enough to know that wasn't the only reason why Bill got all A's on his report cards, or why his teachers liked his compositions so well. Telling was only part of it. Bill was good at seeing. The boat nearly whistled along the diagonal channel, just a page torn from the classified section of the Derry News, but now George imagined it as a PT boat in a war movie, like the ones he sometimes saw down at the Derry Theater with Bill at Saturday matinees. A war picture, with John Wayne fighting the Japs. The prow of the newspaper boat threw sprays of water to either side as it rushed along, and then it reached the gutter on the left side of Witcham Street. A fresh streamlet rushed over the break in the tar at this point, creating a fairly large whirlpool, and it seemed to him that the boat must be swamped and capsized. It leaned alarmingly, and then George cheered as it righted itself, turned, and went racing on down toward the intersection. George sprinted to catch up. Over his head, a grim gust of October wind rattled the trees, now almost completely unburdened of their freight of colored leaves by the storm, which had been this year a reaper of the most ruthless sort. 2. Sitting up in bed, his cheeks still flushed with heat, but his fever, like the Kenduskeag, finally receding, Bill had finished the boat. But when George reached for it, Bill held it out of reach. Now get me the paraffin. What's that? Where is it? It's on the cellar shelf as you go downstairs, Bill said. In a box that says Gulf. Bring that to me, and a knife, and a bowl, and a pack of matches. George had gone obediently to get these things. He could hear his mother playing the piano, not Für Elisa now, but something else he didn't like so well, something that sounded dry and fussy. He could hear rain flicking steadily against the kitchen windows. These were comfortable sounds, but the thought of the cellar was not a bit comfortable. He did not like the cellar, and he did not like going down the cellar stairs because he always imagined there was something down there in the dark. That was silly, of course. His father said so, and his mother said so, and, even more important, Bill said so. But still, he did not even like opening the door to flick on the light, because he always had the idea, this was so exquisitely stupid he didn't dare tell anyone, that while he was feeling for the light switch, some horrible clawed paw would settle lightly over his wrist and then jerk him down into the darkness that smelled of dirt and wet and dim rotted vegetables. Stupid. There were no things with claws, all hairy and full of killing spite. Every now and then someone went crazy and killed a lot of people. Sometimes Chet Huntley told about such things on the evening news, and of course there were commies. But there was no weirdo monster living down in their cellar. Still, this idea lingered. In those interminable moments, while he was groping for the switch with his right hand, his left arm curled around the door jamb in a death grip. That cellar smell seemed to intensify until it filled the world. Smells of dirt and wet and long-gone vegetables would merge into one unmistakable, ineluctable smell, the smell of the monster. The apotheosis of all monsters. It was the smell of something for which he had no name. The smell of it, crouched and lurking and ready to spring. A creature which would eat anything, but which was especially hungry for boy meat. He had opened the door that morning and had groped interminably for the switch, holding the jam in his usual death grip, his eyes squinched shut, the tip of his tongue poked from the corner of his mouth like an agonized rootlet searching for water in a place of drought. Funny? Sure, you betcha. Look at you, Georgie. Georgie's scared of the dark. What a baby. The sound of the piano came from what his father called the living room and what his mother called the parlor. It sounded like music from another world, far away. The way talk and laughter on a summer-crowded beach must sound to an exhausted swimmer who struggles with the undertow. His fingers found the switch. Ah. They snapped it. And nothing. No light. Oh, cripes. The power. George snatched his arm back as if from a basket filled with snakes. He stepped back from the open cellar door, his heart hurrying in his chest. The power was out, of course. He'd forgotten the power was out. Jeezly crow. What now? Go back and tell Bill he couldn't get the box of paraffin because the power was out and he was afraid that something might get him as he stood on the cellar stairs? Something that wasn't a commie or a mass murderer, but a creature much worse than either? That it would simply slither part of its rotted self up between the stair rises and grab his ankle? Well, that would go over big, wouldn't it? Others might laugh at such a fancy, but Bill wouldn't laugh. Bill would be mad. Bill would say, "Grow up, Georgie. You want this boat or not?" As if this thought were his cue, Bill called from his bedroom. "Did you die out there, Georgie?" "No, I'm getting it, Bill," George called back at once. He rubbed at his arms, trying to make the guilty goose flesh disappear and be smooth skin again. "I just stopped to get a drink of water." "Well, hurry up." So he walked down the 4 steps to the cellar shelf, his heart a warm, beating hammer in his throat. The hair on the nape of his neck standing at attention, his eyes hot, his hands cold. Sure that at any moment the cellar door would swing shut on its own, closing off the white light falling through the kitchen windows. and then he would hear it. Something worse than all the commies and murderers in the world. Worse than the Japs. Worse than Attila the Hun. Worse than the somethings in 100 horror movies. It, growling deeply. He would hear the growl in those lunatic seconds before it pounced on him and unzipped his guts. The cellar smell was worse than ever today, because of the flood. Their house was high on Witcham Street, near the crest of the hill, and they had escaped the worst of it. But there was still standing water down there that had seeped in through the old rock foundations. The smell was low and unpleasant, making you want to take only the shallowest breaths. George sifted through the junk on the shelf as fast as he could. Old cans of kiwi shoe polish and shoe polish rags, a broken kerosene lamp, 2 mostly empty bottles of Windex, an old flat can of turtle wax. For some reason this can struck him, and he spent nearly 30 seconds looking at the turtle on the lid, with a kind of hypnotic wonder. Then he tossed it back. And here it was at last, a square box with the word Gulf on it. George snatched it and ran up the stairs as fast as he could, suddenly aware that his shirt tail was out and suddenly sure that his shirt tail would be his undoing. The thing in the cellar would allow him to get almost all the way out, and then it would grab the tail of his shirt and snatch him back, and... He reached the kitchen and swept the door shut behind him. It banged, gustily. He leaned back against it with his eyes closed. Sweat popped out on his arms and forehead. The box of paraffin gripped tightly in one hand. The piano had come to a stop, and his mom's voice floated to him. "Georgie, can't you slam that door a little harder next time? Maybe you could break some of the plates in the Welsh dresser if you really tried." "Sorry, Mom," he called back. "Georgie, you waste," Bill said from his bedroom. He pitched his voice low so their mother would not hear. George snickered a little. His fear was already gone. It had slipped away from him as easily as a nightmare slips away from a man who awakes cold-skinned and gasping from its grip, who feels his body and stares at his surroundings to make sure that none of it ever happened, and who then begins at once to forget it. Half is gone by the time his feet hit the floor, 3/4 of it by the time he emerges from the shower and begins to towel off, all of it by the time he finishes his breakfast, all gone, until the next time when, in the grip of the nightmare, all fears will be remembered. That turtle, George thought, going to the counter drawer where the matches were kept. Where did I see a turtle like that before? But no answer came, and he dismissed the question. He got a pack of matches from the drawer, a knife from the rack, holding the sharp edge studiously away from his body as his dad had taught him, and a small bowl from the Welsh dresser in the dining room. Then he went back into Bill's room. "What an a-hole you are, Georgie," Bill said amiably enough, and pushed back some of the sick stuff on his night table. An empty glass, a pitcher of water, Kleenex, books, a bottle of Vicks Vapor Rub, the smell of which Bill would associate all his life with thick, phlegmy chests and snotty noses. The old Philco radio was there, too, playing not Chopin or Bach, but a Little Richard tune. Very softly, however, so softly that Little Richard was robbed of all his raw and elemental power. Their mother, who had studied classical piano at Juilliard, hated rock and roll. She did not merely dislike it, she abominated it. "I'm no a-hole," George said, sitting on the edge of Bill's bed and putting the things he had gathered on the night table. "Yes, you are," Bill said. "Nothing but a great big brown a-hole. That's you." George tried to imagine a kid who was nothing but a great big a-hole on legs and began to giggle. "Your a-hole is bigger than Augusta," Bill said, beginning to giggle too. "Your a-hole is bigger than the whole state," George replied. This broke both boys up for nearly 2 minutes. There followed a whispered conversation of the sort which means very little to anyone save small boys. Accusations of who was the biggest a-hole, who had the biggest a-hole, which a-hole was the brownest, and so on. Finally, Bill said one of the forbidden words. He accused George of being a big, brown, shitty a-hole. and they both got laughing hard. Bill's laughter turned into a coughing fit. As it finally began to taper off, by then Bill's face had gone a plummy shade, which George regarded with some alarm, the piano stopped again. They both looked in the direction of the parlor, listening for the piano bench to scrape back, listening for their mother's impatient footsteps. Bill buried his mouth in the crook of his elbow, stifling the last of the coughs, pointing at the pitcher at the same time. George poured him a glass of water, which he drank off. The piano began once more, For Eliza again. Stuttering Bill never forgot that piece, and even many years later it never failed to bring goose flesh to his arms and back. His heart would drop, and he would remember. My mother was playing that the day Georgie died. You gonna cough anymore, Bill? No. Bill pulled a Kleenex from the box, made a rumbling sound in his chest, spat phlegm into the tissue, screwed it up and tossed it into the wastebasket by his bed, which was filled with similar twists of tissue. Then he opened the box of paraffin and dropped a waxy cube of the stuff into his palm. George watched him closely, but without speaking or questioning. Bill didn't like George talking to him while he did stuff, but George had learned that if he just kept his mouth shut, Bill would usually explain what he was doing. Bill used the knife to cut off a small piece of the paraffin cube. He put the piece in the bowl, then struck a match and put it on top of the paraffin. The two boys watched the small yellow flame as the dying wind drove rain against the window in occasional spatters. Got to waterproof the boat or it'll just get wet and sink, Bill said. When he was with George, his stutter was light. Sometimes he didn't stutter at all. In school, however, it could become so bad that talking became impossible for him. Communication would cease, and Bill's schoolmates would look somewhere else, while Bill clutched the sides of his desk, his face growing almost as red as his hair, his eyes squeezed into slits as he tried to winch some word out of his stubborn throat. Sometimes, most times, the word would come. Other times it simply refused. He had been hit by a car when he was 3 and knocked into the side of a building. He had remained unconscious for 7 hours. Mom said it was that accident which had caused the stutter. George sometimes got the feeling that his dad, and Bill himself, was not so sure. The piece of paraffin in the bowl was almost entirely melted. The match flame guttered lower, growing blue as it hugged the cardboard stick, and then it went out. Bill dipped his finger into the liquid, jerked it out with a faint hiss. He smiled apologetically at George. Hot, he said. After a few seconds, he dipped his finger in again and began to smear the wax along the sides of the boat, where it quickly dried to a milky haze. Can I do some? George asked. Okay. Just don't get any on the blankets or Mom will kill you. George dipped his finger into the paraffin, which was now very warm but no longer hot, and began to spread it along the other side of the boat. Don't put on so much, you a-hole, Bill said. You want to sink it on its maiden cruise? I'm sorry. It's all right, just go easy. George finished the other side, then held the boat in his hands. It felt a little heavier, but not much. Too cool, he said. I'm going to go out and sail it. Yeah, you do that, Bill said. He suddenly looked tired and still not very well. I wish you could come, George said. He really did. Bill sometimes got bossy after a while, but he always had the coolest ideas, and he hardly ever hit. It's your boat, really. She, Bill said. You call boats she. She, then. I wish I could come, too, Bill said glumly. Well, George shifted from one foot to the other, the boat in his hands. You put on your rain stuff, Bill said, or you'll wind up with the flu like me. Probably catch it anyway from my germs. Thanks, Bill. It's a neat boat. And he did something he hadn't done for a long time, something Bill never forgot. He leaned over and kissed his brother's cheek. You'll catch it for sure now, you a-hole, Bill said. But he seemed cheered up all the same. He smiled at George. Put all this stuff back, too, or Mom will have a bird. Sure. He gathered up the waterproofing equipment and crossed the room. The boat perched precariously on top of the paraffin box, which was sitting askew in the little bowl. Georgie. George turned back to look at his brother. Be careful. Sure. His brow creased a little. That was something your mom said, not your big brother. It was as strange as him giving Bill a kiss. Sure I will. He went out. Bill never saw him again. 3. Now here he was, chasing his boat down the left side of Witcham Street. He was running fast, but the water was running faster, and his boat was pulling ahead. He heard a deepening roar, and saw that 50 yards farther down the hill the water in the gutter was cascading into a storm drain that was still open. It was a long, dark semicircle, cut into the curbing, and as George watched, a stripped branch, its bark as dark and glistening as sealskin, shot into the storm drain's maw. It hung up there for a moment and then slipped down inside. That was where his boat was headed. "Oh, shit and shinola!" he yelled, dismayed. He put on speed, and for a moment he thought he would catch the boat. Then one of his feet slipped, and he went sprawling, skinning one knee and crying out in pain. From his new pavement-level perspective, he watched his boat swing around twice, momentarily caught in another whirlpool, and then disappear. "Shit and shinola!" he yelled again, and slammed his fist down on the pavement. That hurt, too, and he began to cry a little. What a stupid way to lose the boat. He got up and walked over to the storm drain. He dropped to his knees and peered in. The water made a dank, hollow sound as it fell into the darkness. It was a spooky sound. It reminded him of... Huh! The sound was jerked out of him as if on a string, and he recoiled. There were yellow eyes in there. The sort of eyes he had always imagined but never actually seen down in the basement. It's an animal, he thought incoherently. That's all it is. Some animal, maybe a house cat that got stuck down in there. Still, he was ready to run, would run in a second or two, when his mental switchboard had dealt with the shock those two shiny yellow eyes had given him. He felt the rough surface of the macadam under his fingers, and the thin sheet of cold water flowing around them. He saw himself getting up and backing away, and that was when a voice, a perfectly reasonable and rather pleasant voice, spoke to him from inside the storm drain. "Hi, Georgie," it said. George blinked and looked again. He could barely credit what he saw. It was like something from a made-up story or a movie, where you know the animals will talk and dance. If he had been 10 years older, he would not have believed what he was seeing, but he was not 16. He was 6. There was a clown in the storm drain. The light in there was far from good, but it was good enough so that George Denbrough was sure of what he was seeing. It was a clown, like in the circus or on TV. In fact, he looked like a cross between Bozo and Clarabelle, who talked by honking his, or was it her? George was never really sure of the gender. Horn on Howdy Doody Saturday mornings. Buffalo Bob was just about the only one who could understand Clarabelle. And that always cracked George up. The face of the clown in the storm drain was white. There were funny tufts of red hair on either side of his bald head, and there was a big clown smile painted over his mouth. If George had been inhabiting a later year, he would have surely thought of Ronald McDonald before Bozo or Clarabelle. The clown held a bunch of balloons, all colors, like gorgeous ripe fruit in one hand. In the other, he held George's newspaper boat. "Want your boat, Georgie?" the clown smiled. George smiled back. He couldn't help it. It was the kind of smile you just had to answer. "I sure do," he said. The clown laughed. "I sure do. That's good. That's very good. And how about a balloon?" "Well, sure." He reached forward, and then drew his hand reluctantly back. "I'm not supposed to take stuff from strangers. My dad said so." Very wise of your dad, the clown in the storm drain said, smiling. How, George wondered, could I have thought his eyes were yellow? They were a bright dancing blue, the color of his mom's eyes and Bill's. Very wise indeed. Therefore I will introduce myself. I, Georgie, am Mr. Bob Gray, also known as Pennywise, the dancing clown. Pennywise, meet George Denbrough. George, meet Pennywise. And now we know each other. I'm not a stranger to you, and you're not a stranger to me. Correct? George giggled. I guess so. He reached forward again and drew his hand back again. How did you get down there? Storm just blew me away, Pennywise the dancing clown said. It blew the whole circus away. Can you smell the circus, Georgie? George leaned forward. Suddenly, he could smell peanuts, hot roasted peanuts, and vinegar, the white kind you put on your French fries through a hole in the cap. He could smell cotton candy and frying doughboys and the faint but thunderous odor of wild animal shit. He could smell the cheery aroma of Midway sawdust. And yet, under it all, was the smell of flood and decomposing leaves and dark storm drain shadows. That smell was wet and rotten. The cellar smell. But the other smells were stronger. You bet I can smell it, he said. Want your boat, Georgie? Pennywise asked. I only repeat myself because you really do not seem that eager. He held it up, smiling. He was wearing a baggy silk suit with great big orange buttons, a bright tie, electric blue, flopped down his front, and on his hands were big white gloves like the kind Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck always wore. Yes, sure, George said, looking into the storm drain. And a balloon? I've got red and green and yellow and blue. Do they float? Float? The clown's grin widened. Oh, yes, indeed they do. They float. And there's cotton candy. George reached. The clown seized his arm, and George saw the clown's face change. What he saw then was terrible enough to make his worst imaginings of the thing in the cellar look like sweet dreams. What he saw destroyed his sanity in one clawing stroke. They float. The thing in the drain crooned in a clotted, chuckling voice. It held George's arm in its thick and wormy grip. It pulled George toward that terrible darkness, where the water rushed and roared and bellowed as it bore its cargo of storm debris toward the sea. George craned his neck away from that final blackness and began to scream into the rain, to scream mindlessly into the white autumn sky which curved above Darien that day in the fall of 1957. His screams were shrill and piercing, and all up and down Witcham Street people came to their windows or bolted out onto their porches. They float, it growled. They float, Georgie. And when you're down here with me, you'll float, too. George's shoulder socked against the cement of the curb, and Dave Gardner, who had stayed home from his job at the shoe boat that day because of the flood, saw only a small boy in a yellow rain slicker, a small boy who was screaming and writhing in the gutter with muddy water surfing over his face and making his screams sound bubbly. Everything down here floats. That chuckling, rotten voice whispered. And suddenly there was a ripping noise and a flaring sheet of agony, and George Denbrough knew no more. Dave Gardner was the first to get there, and although he arrived only 45 seconds after the first scream, George Denbrough was already dead. Gardner grabbed him by the back of the slicker, pulled him into the street, and began to scream himself as George's body turned over in his hands. The left side of George's slicker was now bright red. Blood flowed into the storm drain from the tattered hole where the left arm had been. A knob of bone, horribly bright, peeked through the torn cloth. The boy's eyes stared up into the white sky. And as Dave staggered away toward the others already running pell-mell down the street, they began to fill up with rain. 4. Somewhere below, in the storm drain that was already filled nearly to capacity with runoff, there could have been no one down there, the county sheriff would later exclaim to a Derry news reporter, with a frustrated fury so great it was almost agony. Hercules himself would have been swept away in that driving current. George's newspaper boat shot onward through nighted chambers and long concrete hallways that roared and chimed with water. For a while it ran neck and neck with a dead chicken that floated with its yellowy reptilian toes pointed at the dripping ceiling. Then at some junction east of town the chicken was swept off to the left, while George's boat went straight. An hour later, while George's mother was being sedated in the emergency room at Derry Home Hospital, and while stuttering Bill sat stunned and white and silent in his bed, listening to his father sob hoarsely in the parlor, where his mother had been playing Feu Elisa when George went out, the boat shot out through a concrete loophole, like a bullet exiting the muzzle of a gun, and ran at speed down a sluiceway and into an unnamed stream. When it joined the boiling, swollen Penobscot River 20 minutes later, the first rifts of blue had begun to show in the sky overhead. The storm was over. The boat dipped and swayed and sometimes took on water, but it did not sink. The two brothers had waterproofed it well. I do not know where it finally fetched up, if ever it did. Perhaps it reached the sea and sails there forever, like a magic boat in a fairy tale. All I know is that it was still afloat and still running on the breast of the flood when it passed the incorporated town limits of Derry, Maine, and there it passes out of this tale, forever. Chapter 2. After the Festival, 1984. 1. The reason Adrian was wearing the hat, his sobbing boyfriend would later tell the police, was because he had won it at the Pitch Till You Win stall on the Bassey Park Fairgrounds just 6 days before his death. He was proud of it. He was wearing it because he loved this shitty little town, the boyfriend Don Haggerty screamed at the cops. Now, there's no need for that sort of language, Officer Harold Gardner told Haggerty. Harold Gardner was one of Dave Gardner's 4 sons. On the day his father had discovered the lifeless, one-armed body of George Dembro, Harold Gardner had been 5. On this day, almost 27 years later, he was 32 and balding. Harold Gardner recognized the reality of Don Haggerty's grief and pain, and at the same time found it impossible to take seriously. This man, if you want to call him a man, was wearing lipstick and satin pants so tight you could almost read the wrinkles in his cock. Grief or no grief, pain or no pain, he was, after all, just a queer. Like his friend, the late Adrian Mellon. Let's go through it again, Harold's partner Jeffrey Reeves said. The two of you came out of the Falcon and turned toward the canal. Then what? How many times do I have to tell you idiots? Haggerty was still screaming. They killed him! They pushed him over the side! Just another day in Macho City for them! Don Haggerty began to cry. One more time, Reeves repeated patiently. You came out of the Falcon, then what? 2. In an interrogation room just down the hall, 2 Derry cops are speaking with Steve Dubé, 17. In the clerk of probate's office upstairs, 2 more were questioning John Webby Garton, 18. And in the chief of police's office on the 5th floor, Chief Andrew Rademacher and Assistant District Attorney Tom Boutillier were questioning 15-year-old Christopher Unwin. Unwin, who wore faded jeans, a grease-smeared T-shirt, and blocky engineer boots, was weeping. Rademacher and Boutillier had taken him because they had quite accurately assessed him as the weak link in the chain. Let's go through it again, Boutillier said in this office, just as Jeffrey Reeves was saying the same thing 2 floors down. We didn't mean to kill him, Unwin blubbered. It was the hat. We couldn't believe he was still wearing the hat after what Webby said the first time. And I guess we wanted to scare him. For what he said, Chief Rademacher interjected. Yes. To John Garton on the afternoon of the 17th. Yes. To Webby. Unwin burst into fresh tears. But we tried to save him when he saw he was in trouble. At least me and Steve DeBay did. We didn't mean to kill him. Come on, Chris, don't shit us, Boutillier said. You threw the little queer into the canal. Yes, but... And the three of you came in to make a clean breast of things. Chief Rademacher and I appreciate that, don't we, Andy? You bet. Takes a man to own up to what he did, Chris. So don't fuck yourself up by lying now. You meant to throw him over the minute you saw him and his fag buddy coming out of the Falcon, didn't you? No! Chris Unwin protested vehemently. Boutillier took a pack of Marlboros from his shirt pocket and stuck one in his mouth. He offered the pack to Unwin. Cigarette? Unwin took one. Boutillier had to chase the tip with a match in order to give him a light because of the way Unwin's mouth was trembling. But when you saw he was wearing the hat, Rademacher asked. Unwin dragged deep, lowered his head so that his greasy hair fell in his eyes and jetted smoke from his nose, which was littered with blackheads. Yeah, he said, almost too softly to be heard. Boutillier leaned forward, brown eyes gleaming. His face was predatory, but his voice was gentle. What, Chris? I said yes. I guess so, to throw him in, but not to kill him. He looked up at them, face frantic and miserable, and still unable to comprehend the stupendous changes which had taken place in his life since he left the house to take in the last night of Derry's Canal Days Festival with two of his buddies at 7:30 the previous evening. Not to kill him, he repeated. And that guy under the bridge, I still don't know who he was. What guy was that? Rademacher asked, but without much interest. They had heard this part before as well, and neither of them believed it. Sooner or later, men accused of murder almost always drag out that mysterious other guy. Boutillier even had a name for it. He called it the one-armed man syndrome, after that old TV series, The Fugitive. The guy in the clown suit, Chris Unwin said, and shivered. The guy with the balloons. 3. The Canal Days Festival, which ran from July 15th to July 21st, had been a rousing success, most Derry residents agreed. A great thing for the city's morale, image, and pocketbook. The week-long festival was pegged to mark the centenary of the opening of the canal, which ran through the middle of downtown. It had been the canal which had fully opened Derry to the lumber trade in the years 1884 to 1910. It had been the canal which had birthed Derry's boom years. The town was spruced up from east to west and north to south. Potholes, which some residents swore hadn't been patched for 10 years or more, were neatly filled with hot top and rolled smooth. The town buildings were refurbished on the inside, repainted on the outside. The worst of the graffiti in Bassey Park, much of it coolly logical anti-gay statements such as "kill all queers" and "AIDS from God, you hellbound homos," was sanded off the benches and wooden walls of the little covered walkway over the canal known as the Kissing Bridge. A Canal Days museum was installed in 3 empty storefronts downtown and filled with exhibits by Michael Hanlon, a local librarian and amateur historian. The town's oldest families loaned freely of their almost priceless treasures, and during the week of the festival nearly 40,000 visitors paid a quarter each to look at eating house menus from the 1890s, loggers' bits, axes, and peavies from the 1880s, children's toys from the 1920s, and over 2,000 photographs and 9 reels of movie film of life as it had been in Derry over the last 100 years. The museum was sponsored by the Derry Ladies' Society, which vetoed some of Hanlon's proposed exhibits, such as the notorious tramp chair from the 1930s, and photographs, such as those of the Bradley gang after the notorious shootout. But all agreed it was a great success, and no one really wanted to see those gory old things anyway. It was so much better to accentuate the positive and eliminate the negative, as the old song said. There was a huge striped refreshment tent in Derry Park, and band concerts there every night. In Bassey Park, there was a carnival with rides by Smokey's Greater Shows and games run by local townfolk. A special tram car circled the historic sections of the town every hour on the hour, and ended up at this gaudy and amiable money machine. It was here that Adrian Mellon won the hat, which would get him killed. The paper top hat with the flower and the band which said, "I Heart Derry." 4. "I'm tired," John Webby Garton said. Like his two friends, he was dressed in unconscious imitation of Bruce Springsteen, although if asked, he would probably call Springsteen a wimp or a fagola, and would instead profess admiration for such bitchin' heavy metal groups as Def Leppard, Twisted Sister, or Judas Priest. The sleeves of his plain blue t-shirt were torn off, showing his heavily muscled arms. His thick brown hair fell over one eye. This touch was more John Cougar Mellencamp than Springsteen. There were blue tattoos on his arms, arcane symbols which looked as if they had been drawn by a child. "I don't want to talk no more." "Just tell us about Tuesday afternoon at the fair," Paul Hughes said. Hughes was tired and shocked and dismayed by this whole sordid business. He thought again and again that it was as if Derry Canal days ended with one final event which everyone had somehow known about, but which no one had quite dared to put down on the daily program of events. If they had, it would have looked like this. Saturday, 9:00 p.m. Final band concert featuring the Derry High School Band and the barbershop Mellow Men. Saturday, 10:00 p.m. Giant fireworks show. Saturday, 10:35 p.m. Ritual sacrifice of Adrian Mellon officially ends Canal Days. "Fuck the fair," Webby replied. "Just what you said to Mellon and what he said to you." "Oh, Christ." Webby rolled his eyes. "Come on, Webby," Hughes' partner said. Webby Garton rolled his eyes and began again. 5. Garton saw the two of them, Mellon and Haggerty, mincing along with their arms about each other's waists and giggling like a couple of girls. At first he actually thought they were a couple of girls. Then he recognized Mellon, who had been pointed out to him before. As he looked, he saw Mellon turn to Haggerty, and they kissed briefly. "Oh man, I'm gonna barf," Webby cried, disgusted. Chris Unwin and Steve Dubé were with him. When Webby pointed out Mellon, Steve Dubé said he thought the other fag was named Don somebody, and that he'd picked up a kid from Derry High hitching, and then tried to put a few moves on him. Mellon and Haggerty began to move toward the three boys again, walking away from the Pitch Till You Win and toward the Carney's exit. Webby Garton would later tell officers Hughes and Conley that his civic pride had been wounded by seeing a fucking faggot wearing a hat which said, "I Heart Derry." It was a silly thing, that hat, a paper imitation of a top hat, with a great big flower sticking up from the top and nodding about in every direction. The silliness of the hat apparently wounded Webby's civic pride even more. As Mellon and Haggerty passed, each with his arm linked about the other's waist, Webby Garton yelled out, "I ought to make you eat that hat, you fucking ass bandit!" Mellon turned toward Garton, fluttering his eyes flirtatiously, and said, "If you want something to eat, hun, I could find something much tastier than my hat." At this point, Webby Garton decided he was going to rearrange the faggot's face. In the geography of Mellon's face, mountains would rise and continents would drift. Nobody suggested he sucked the root. Nobody. He started toward Mellon. Mellon's friend Haggerty, alarmed, attempted to pull Mellon away, but Mellon stood his ground, smiling. Garton would later tell officers Hughes and Conley that he was pretty sure Mellon was high on something. So he was, Haggerty would agree, when this idea was passed on to him by officers Gardner and Reeves. He was high on 2 fried doughboys smeared with honey, on the carnival, on the whole day. He had been consequently unable to recognize the real menace which Webby Garton represented. "But that was Adrian," Don said, using a tissue to wipe his eyes and smearing the spangled eyeshadow he was wearing. didn't have much in the way of protective coloration. He was one of those fools who think things really are going to turn out all right. He might have been badly hurt there and then if Garton hadn't felt something tap his elbow. It was a nightstick. He turned his head to see Officer Frank Machin, another member of Derry's finest. "Never mind, little buddy," Machin told Garton. "Mind your business and leave those little gay boyos alone. Have some fun." "Did you hear what he called me?" Garton asked hotly. He was now joined by Unwin and Dubé. The two of them, smelling trouble, tried to urge Garton on up the midway, but Garton shrugged them away, would have turned on them with his fists if they had persisted. His masculinity had borne an insult which he felt must be avenged. Nobody suggested he suck the root. Nobody. "I don't believe he called you anything," Machin replied. "And you spoke to him first, I believe. Now move on, Sonny. I don't want to have to tell you again." "He called me a queer." "Oh, you might be, then?" Machin asked, seeming to be honestly interested, and Garton flushed a deep, ugly red. During this exchange, Haggerty was trying with increasing desperation to pull Adrian Mellon away from the scene. Now at last, Mellon was going. "Ta-ta, love," Adrian called cheekily over his shoulder. "Shut up, candy ass," Machin said. "Get out of here." Garton made a lunge at Mellon, and Machin grabbed him. "I could run you in, my friend," Machin said. "And the way you're acting, it might not be such a bad idea. Next time I see you, I'm gonna hurt you," Garton bellowed after the departing pair, and heads turned to stare at him. "And if you're wearing that hat, I'm gonna kill you. This town don't need no faggots like you." Without turning, Mellon waggled the fingers of his left hand. The nails were painted cerise, and put an extra little wiggle in his walk. Garton lunged again. "One more word, or one more move, and in you go," Machin said mildly. "Trust me, my boy, for I mean exactly what I say." "Come on, Webby," Chris Unwin said uneasily. "Mellow out." "You like guys like that?" Webby asked Machin, ignoring Chris and Steve completely. "Huh?" "About the bum punches, I'm neutral," Machin said. "What I'm really in favor of is peace and quiet, and you are upsetting what I like, Pizza Face. Now do you want to go around with me or what?" "Come on, Webby," Steve Dubé said quietly. "Let's go get some hot dogs." Webby went, straightening his shirt with exaggerated moves and brushing the hair out of his eyes. Machin, who also gave a statement on the morning following Adrian Mellon's death, said, "The last thing I heard him say as him and his buddies walked off was, 'Next time I see him, he's gonna be in serious hurt.'" 6. "Please, I gotta talk to my mother," Steve Dubé said for the third time. "I gotta get her to mellow out my stepfather, or there's gonna be one hell of a punching match when I get home." "In a little while," Officer Charles Averino told him. Both Averino and his partner, Barney Morrison, knew that Steve Dubé would not be going home tonight, maybe not for many nights to come. The boy did not seem to realize just how heavy this particular bust was, and Averino would not be surprised when he learned later on that Dubé had left school at age 16. At that time, he had still been in Water Street Junior High. His IQ was 68, according to the Wexler he had taken during one of his 3 trips to the 7th grade. "Tell us what happened when you saw Mellon coming out of the Falcon," Morrison invited. "No, man, I better not." "Well, why not?" Averino asked. "I already talked too much, maybe." "You came in to talk," Averino said. "Isn't that right?" "Well, yeah, but..." "Listen," Morrison said warmly, sitting down next to Dubé and shooting him a cigarette. "You think me and Chick here like fags?" "I don't know. Do we look like we like fags?" "No, but we're your friends, Steve-O," Morrison said solemnly. "And believe me, you and Chris and Webby need all the friends you can get just about now. Because tomorrow every bleeding heart in this town is going to be screaming for your guys' blood." Steve Dubé looked dimly alarmed. Averino, who could almost read this hairbag's pussy little mind, suspected he was thinking about his stepfather again. And although Averino had no liking for Derry's small gay community, Like every other cop on the force, he would enjoy seeing the Falcon shut up forever. He would have been delighted to drive DeBay home himself. He would, in fact, have been delighted to hold DeBay's arms while DeBay's stepfather beat the creep to oatmeal. Averino did not like gays, but this did not mean he believed they should be tortured and murdered. Mellon had been savaged. When they brought him up from under the canal bridge, his eyes had been opened, bulging with terror. And this guy here had absolutely no idea what he had helped do. "We didn't mean to hurt him," Steve repeated. This was his fallback position when he became even slightly confused. "That's why you want to get out front with us," Averino said earnestly. "Get the true facts of the matter out in front, and this maybe won't amount to a piss hole in the snow. Isn't that right, Barney?" "As rain," Morrison agreed. "One more time. What do you say?" Averino coaxed. "Well," Steve said, and then slowly began to talk. 7. When the Falcon was opened in 1973, Elmer Curti thought his clientele would consist mostly of bus riders. The terminal next door serviced 3 different lines: Trailways, Greyhound, and Aroostook County. What he failed to realize was how many of the passengers who ride buses are women or families with small children in tow. Many of the others kept their bottles in brown bags and never got off the bus at all. Those who did were usually soldiers or sailors who wanted no more than a quick beer or two. You couldn't very well go on a bender during a 10-minute rest stop. Curti had begun to realize some of these home truths by 1977, but by then it was too late. He was up to his tits in bills. There was no way that he could see out of the red ink. The idea of burning the place down for the insurance occurred to him, but unless he hired a professional to torch it, he supposed he would be caught. He had no idea where professional arsonists hung out, anyway. He decided in February of that year that he would give it until July 4th. If things didn't look as if they were turning around by then, he would simply walk next door, get on a Hound, and see how things looked down in Florida. But in the next 5 months, an amazing, quiet sort of prosperity came to the bar, which was painted black and gold inside, and decorated with stuffed birds. Elmer Curti's brother had been an amateur taxidermist who specialized in birds, and Elmer had inherited the stuff when he died. Suddenly, instead of drawing 60 beers and pouring maybe 28 drinks a night, Elmer was drawing 80 beers and pouring 100 drinks, 120, sometimes 160. His clientele was young, polite, almost exclusively male. Many of them dressed outrageously, but those were years when outrageous dress was still almost the norm. And Elmer Curti did not realize that his patrons were just about almost exclusively gay until 1981 or so. If Derry residents had heard him say this, they would have laughed and said that Elmer Curti must think they had all been born yesterday. But his claim was perfectly true. Like the man with the cheating wife, he was practically the last to know. And by the time he did, he didn't care. The bar was making money, and while there were 4 other bars in Derry which turned a profit, the Falcon was the only one where rambunctious patrons did not regularly demolish the whole place. There were no women to fight over, for one thing, and these men, fags or not, seemed to have learned a secret of getting along with each other which their heterosexual counterparts did not know. Once he became aware of the sexual preference of his regulars, he seemed to hear lurid stories about the Falcon everywhere. These stories had been circulating for years, but until '81, Curti simply hadn't heard them. The most enthusiastic tellers of these tales, he came to realize, were men who wouldn't be dragged into the Falcon with a chain fall for fear all the muscles would go out of their wrists or something. Yet they seemed privy to all sorts of information. According to the stories, you can go in there any night and see men close dancing, rubbing their cocks together right out on the dance floor. Men French kissing at the bar, men getting blowjobs in the bathrooms. There was supposedly a room out back where you went if you wanted to spend a little time on the Tower of Power. There was a big old fellow in a Nazi uniform back there who kept his arm greased most of the way to the shoulder, and who would be happy to take care of you. In fact, none of these things were true. When folks with a thirst did come in from the bus station for a beer or a highball, they sensed nothing out of the ordinary in the Falcon at all. There were a lot of guys, sure, but that was no different than thousands of working men's bars all across the country. The clientele was gay, but gay was not a synonym for stupid. They wanted a little outrageousness, they went to Portland. They wanted a lot of outrageousness, Ramrod-style outrageousness, or Peck's Big Boy-style outrageousness. They went down to New York or Boston. Derry was small, Derry was provincial, and Derry's small gay community understood the shadow under which it existed quite well. Don Haggerty had been coming into the Falcon for 2 or 3 years on the night in March of 1984, when he first showed up with Adrian Mellon. Before then, Haggerty had been the sort who plays the field, rarely showing up with the same escort half a dozen times. But by late April, it had become obvious even to Elmer Curti, who cared very little about such things, that Haggerty and Mellon had a steady thing going. Haggerty was a draftsman with an engineering firm in Bangor. Adrian Mellon was a freelance writer who published anywhere and everywhere he could. Airline magazines, confession magazines, regional magazines, Sunday supplements, sex letter magazines. He'd been working on a novel, but maybe that wasn't serious. He'd been working on it since his 3rd year of college, and that had been 12 years ago. He'd come to Derry to write a piece about the canal. He was on assignment from New England Byways, a glossy bi-monthly that was published in Concord. Adrian Mellon had taken the assignment because he could squeeze Byways for 3 weeks' worth of expense money, including a nice room at the Derry Town House, and gather all the material he needed for the piece in maybe 5 days. During the other 2 weeks, he could gather enough material for maybe 4 other regional pieces. But during that 3-week period, he met Don Haggerty, and instead of going back to Portland when his 3 weeks on the cuff were over, he found himself a small apartment on Kossuth Lane. He lived there for only 6 weeks. Then he moved in with Don Haggerty. 8. That summer, Haggerty told Harold Gardner and Jeff Reeves, was the happiest summer of his life. He should have been on the lookout, he said. He should have known that God only puts a rug under guys like him in order to jerk it out from under their feet. The only shadow, he said, was Adrian's extravagantly partisan reaction to Derry. He had a t-shirt which said, "Maine ain't bad, but Derry's great." He had a Derry Tigers high school jacket, and of course there was the hat. He claimed to find the atmosphere vital and creatively invigorating. Perhaps there was something to this. He had taken his languishing novel out of the trunk for the first time in nearly a year. Was he really working on it then? Gardner asked Haggerty, not really caring, but wanting to keep Haggerty primed. Yes, he was busting pages. He said it might be a terrible novel, but it was no longer going to be a terrible unfinished novel. He expected to finish it by his birthday in October. Of course, he didn't know what Derry was really like. He thought he did, but he hadn't been here long enough to get a whiff of the real Derry. I kept trying to tell him, but he wouldn't listen. And what's Derry really like, Don? Reeves asked. It's a lot like a dead strumpet with maggots squirming out of her coos, Don Haggerty said. The 2 cops stared in silent amazement. It's a bad place, Haggerty said. It's a sewer. You mean you 2 guys don't know that? You 2 guys have lived here all of your lives, and you don't know that? Neither of them answered. After a little while, Haggerty went on. 9. Until Adrian Mellon entered his life, Don had been planning to leave Derry. He'd been there for 3 years, mostly because he had agreed to a long-term lease on an apartment with the world's most fantastic river view. But now the lease was almost up, and Don was glad. No more long commute back and forth to Bangor. No more weird vibes. In Derry, he once told Adrian, it always felt like 13 o'clock. Adrian might think Derry was a great place, but it scared Don. It was not just the town's tightly homophobic attitude. An attitude as clearly expressed by the town's preachers as by the graffiti in Bassey Park. But that was one thing he had been able to put his finger on. Adrian had laughed. Don, every town in America has a contingent that hates the gay folk, he said. Don't tell me you don't know that. This is, after all, the era of Ronnie Moron and Phyllis Housefly. Come down to Bassey Park with me, Don had replied, after seeing that Adrian really meant what he was saying. And what he was really saying was that Derry was no worse than any other fair-sized town in the hinterlands. I want to show you something, my love. They drove to Bassey Park. This had been in mid-June, about a month before Adrian's murder, Haggerty told the cops. He took Adrian into the dark, vaguely unpleasant-smelling shadows of the Kissing Bridge. He pointed out one of the graffiti. Adrian had to strike a match and hold it below the writing in order to read it. Show me your cock queer and I'll cut it off you. I know how people feel about gays, Don said quietly. I got beaten up at a truck stop in Dayton when I was a teenager. Some fellas in Portland set my shoes on fire outside of a sandwich shop while this fat-assed old cop sat inside his cruiser and laughed. I've seen a lot. But I've never seen anything quite like this. Look over here. Check it out. Another match revealed, stick nails in eyes of all faggots, for God. Whoever writes these little homilies has got a case of the deep-down crazies. I'd feel better if I thought it was just one person, one isolated sickie, but... Don swept his arm vaguely down the length of the Kissing Bridge. There's a lot of this stuff. And I just don't think one person did it all. That's why I want to leave Derry, Aid. Too many places and too many people seem to have the deep-down crazies. Well, wait until I finish my novel, okay? Please? October. I promise. No later. The air's better here. He didn't know it was the water he was going to have to watch out for, Don Haggerty said bitterly. 10. Tom Boutillier and Chief Rademacher leaned forward, neither of them speaking. Chris Unwin sat with his head down, talking monotonously to the floor. This was the part they wanted to hear. This was the part that was going to send at least two of these assholes to Thomaston. The fare wasn't no good, Unwin said. They was already taking down all the bitchin' rides, you know, like the Devil Dish and the Parachute Drop. They already had a sign on the bumper cars that said closed. Wasn't nothing open but baby rides. So we went down by the games, and Webby saw the pitch till you win, and he paid 50 cents, and he seen that hat Queer was wearing, and he pitched at that, but kept missing it. And every time he missed, he got more in a bad mood, you know, and Steve, he's the guy who usually goes around saying mellow out, like mellow out this and mellow out that, and why don't you fucking mellow out, you know? Only he was in a real piss-up-a-rope mood because he took this pill, you know? I don't know what kind of a pill, a red pill, maybe it was even legal. But he keeps after Webby until I thought Webby was going to hit him, you know? He goes, you can't even win that queer's hat. You must be really wasted if you can't even win that queer's hat. So finally the lady gives him a prize, even though the ring wasn't over it. So I think she wanted to get rid of us. I don't know. Maybe she didn't, but I think she did. It was this noisemaker thing, you know? You blow it and it puffs up and unrolls and makes a noise like a fart, you know? I used to have one of those. I got it for Halloween or New Year's or some fucking holiday. I thought it was pretty good, only I lost it. Or maybe somebody hawked it out of my pocket in the fucking play yard at school, you know? So then the fair's closing and we're walking out and Steve's still on Webby about not being able to win that queer's hat, you know? And Webby ain't saying much, and I know that's a bad sign, but I was pretty faced, you know. So I knew I ought to, like, change the subject, only I couldn't think of no subject, you know. So when we get to the parking lot, Steve says, where you want to go? Home? And Webby goes, let's cruise by the Falcon first, see if that queer's around. Boutillier and Rademacher exchanged a glance. Boutillier raised a single finger and tapped it against his cheek. Although this doofus in the engineer boots didn't know it, he was now talking about first-degree murder. So I goes, no, I gotta get home. And Webby goes, you scared to go by that queer bar? And I go, fuck no. And Steve's still high or something. He says, let's go grease some queer meat. Let's go grease some queer meat. Let's go grease. 11. timing was just right enough so that things worked out wrong for everyone. Adrian Mellon and Don Haggerty came out of the Falcon after 2 beers, walked up past the bus station, and then linked hands. Neither of them thought about it. It was just something they did. It was 10:20. They reached the corner and turned left. The Kissing Bridge was almost half a mile upriver from here. They meant to cross Main Street Bridge, which was much less picturesque. The Kenduskeag was summer low, no more than 4 feet of water sliding listlessly around the concrete pilings. When the duster drew abreast of them, Steve DeBay had spotted the 2 of them coming out of the Falcon and gleefully pointed them out. They were on the edge of the span. "Cut in! Cut in!" Webby Garton screamed. The 2 men had just passed under a streetlight, and he had spotted the fact that they were holding hands. This infuriated him, but not as much as the hat infuriated him. The big paper flower was nodding crazily this way and that. "Cut in, goddammit!" And Steve did. Chris Unwin would deny active participation in what followed, but Don Haggerty told a different story. He said that Garton was out of the car almost before it stopped, and that the other 2 quickly followed. There was talk, not good talk. There was no attempt at flippancy or false coquetry on Adrian's part this night. He recognized that they were in a lot of trouble. "Give me that hat," Garton said. "Give it to me, queer." "If I do, will you leave us alone?" Adrian was wheezing with fright, almost crying, looking from Unwin to DeBay to Garton with terrified eyes. "Just give me the fucker." Adrian handed it over. Garton produced a switch knife from the left front pocket of his jeans and cut it into 2 pieces. He rubbed the pieces against the seat of his jeans. Then he dropped them to his feet and stomped them. Don Haggerty backed away a little while their attention was divided between Adrian and the hat. He was looking, he said, for a cop. "Now, will you let us alone?" Adrian Mellon began, and that was when Garton punched him in the face, driving him back against the waist-high pedestrian railing of the bridge. Adrian screamed, clapping his hands to his mouth. Blood poured through his fingers. "Aid!" Haggerty cried, and ran forward again. DeBay tripped him. Garton booted him in the stomach, knocking him off the sidewalk and into the roadway. A car passed. Haggerty rose to his knees and screamed at it. It didn't slow. The driver, he told Gardner and Reeves, never even looked around. "Shut up, queer!" DeBay said, and kicked him in the side of the face. Haggerty fell on his side in the gutter, semi-conscious. A few moments later, he heard a voice, Chris Unwin's, telling him to get away before he got what his friend was getting. In his own statement, Unwin verified giving this warning. Haggerty could hear thudding blows and the sound of his lover screaming. Adrian sounded like a rabbit in a snare, he told the police. Haggerty crawled back toward the intersection and the bright lights of the bus station, and when he was a distance away, he turned back to look. Adrian Mellon, who stood about 5'5" and might have weighed 135 pounds soaking wet, was being pushed from Garton to DeBay to Unwin in a kind of triple play. His body jittered and flopped like the body of a rag doll. They were punching him, pummeling him, ripping at his clothes. As he watched, he said, Garton punched Adrian in the crotch. Adrian's hair hung in his face. Blood poured out of his mouth and soaked his shirt. Webby Garton wore 2 heavy rings on his right hand. One was a Derry High School ring. The other one he had made in shop class. An intertwined brass DB stood out 3 inches from this latter. The letters stood for the Dead Bugs, a metal band he particularly admired. The rings had torn Adrian's upper lip open and shattered 3 of his upper teeth at the gum line. "Help!" Haggerty shrieked. "Help! Help! They're killing him! Help!" The buildings of Main Street loomed dark and secret. No one came to help, not even from the one white island of light which marked the bus station. And Haggerty did not see how that could be. There were people in there. He had seen them when he and Aid walked past. Would none of them come to help? None at all. "Help! Help! They're killing him! Help, please! For God's sake! Help. A very small voice whispered from Don Haggerty's left. And then there was a giggle. Bums rush! Garton was yelling now. Yelling and laughing, all three of them. Haggerty told Gardner and Reeves, had been laughing while they beat Adrian up. Bums rush! Over the side! Bums rush! Bums rush! Bums rush! DeBay chanted, laughing. Help. The small voice said again. And although the voice was grave, that little giggle followed again. It was like the voice of a child who cannot help itself. Haggerty looked down and saw the clown. And it was at this point that Gardner and Reeves began to discount everything that Haggerty said, because the rest was the raving of a lunatic. Later, however, Harold Gardner found himself wondering. Later, when he found that the Unwin boy had also seen a clown, or said he had, he began to have second thoughts. His partner either never had them or would never admit to them. The clown, Haggerty said, looked like a cross between Ronald McDonald and that old TV clown, Bozo, or so he thought at first. It was the wild tufts of orange hair that brought such comparisons to mind. But later consideration had caused him to think the clown really looked like neither. The smile painted over the white pancake was red, not orange, and the eyes were a weird, shiny silver. Contact lenses, perhaps, but a part of him thought then, and continued to think, that maybe that silver had been the real color of those eyes. He wore a baggy suit with big orange pom-pom buttons, and his hands were cartoon gloves. "If you need help, Don," the clown said, "help yourself to a balloon." And it offered the bunch it held in one hand. "They float," the clown said. "Down here we all float. Pretty soon, your friend will float too." 12. "This clown called you by name," Jeff Reeves said in a totally expressionless voice. He looked over Haggerty's bent head at Harold Gardner, and one eye drew down in a wink. "Yes," Haggerty said, not looking up. "I know how it sounds." 13. "So then you threw him over," Boutillier said. "Bums rush." "Not me," Unwin said, looking up. He flicked the hair out of his eyes with one hand and stared at them urgently. "When I saw they really meant to do it, I tried to pull Steve away because I knew the guy might get banged up. It was like 10 feet to the water." It was 23. One of Chief Rademacher's patrolmen had already measured. But it was crazy. The two of them kept yelling, "Bums rush, bums rush," and they picked him up. Webby had him under the arms and Steve had him by the seat of the pants, and 14. When Haggerty saw what they were doing, he rushed back toward them, screaming, "No, no, no!" at the top of his voice. Chris Unwin pushed him backward, and Haggerty landed in a teeth-rattling heap on the sidewalk. "You want to go over too?" he whispered. "You run, baby." They threw Adrian Mellon over the bridge and into the water then. Haggerty heard the splash. "Let's get out of here," Steve DeBay said. He and Webby were backing toward the car. Chris Unwin went to the railing and looked over. He saw Haggerty first, sliding and clawing his way down the weedy, trash-littered embankment to the water. Then he saw the clown. The clown was dragging Adrian out on the far side with one arm. Its balloons were in its other hand. Adrian was dripping wet, choking, moaning. The clown twisted its head and grinned up at Chris. Chris said he saw its shining silver eyes and its bared teeth. "Great, big teeth," he said. "Like the lion in the circus, man," he said. "I mean, they were that big." Then, he said, he saw the clown shove one of Adrian Mellon's arms back so it lay over his head. Then what, Chris? Butilier said. He was bored with this part. Fairy tales had bored him since the age of 8 on. I don't know, Chris said. That was when Steve grabbed me and hauled me into the car, but I think it bit into his armpit. He looked up at them again, uncertain now. I think that's what it did. Bit into his armpit. Like it wanted to eat him, man. Like it wanted to eat his heart. 15. No, Haggerty said when he was presented with Chris Unwin's story in the form of questions. The clown did not drag Aid up on the far bank, at least not that he saw. And he would grant that he had been something less than a disinterested observer by that point. By that point, he had been out of his fucking mind. The clown, he said, was standing near the far bank with Adrian's dripping body clutched in its arms. Aid's right arm was stuck stiffly out behind the clown's head, and the clown's face was indeed in Aid's right armpit, but it was not biting. It was smiling. Haggerty could see it looking out from beneath Aid's arm, and smiling. The clown's arms tightened, and Haggerty heard ribs splinter. Aid shrieked. "Float with us, Don," the clown said out of its grinning red mouth, and then pointed with one of its white-gloved hands under the bridge. Balloons floated against the underside of the bridge, not a dozen or a dozen dozens, but thousands, red and blue and green and yellow, and printed on the side of each was, "I heart Derry." 16. Well, now, that surely does sound like a lot of balloons, Reeves said, and tipped Harold Gardner another wink. I know how it sounds, Haggerty reiterated in the same dreary voice. You saw those balloons, Gardner said. Don Haggerty slowly held his hands up in front of his face. I saw them as clearly as I can see my own fingers at this moment. Thousands of them. You couldn't even see the underside of the bridge. There were too many of them. They were rippling a little, and sort of bouncing up and down. There was a sound, a funny low squealing noise. That was their sides rubbing together. And strings. There was a forest of white strings hanging down. They looked like white strands of spider web. The clown took Aid under there. I could see its suit brushing through those strings. Aid was making awful, choking sounds. I started after him, and the clown looked back. I saw its eyes, and all at once I understood who it was. Who was it, Don? Harold Gardner asked softly. It was Derry, Don Haggerty said. It was this town. And what did you do then? It was Reeves. I ran. You dumb shit, Haggerty said, and burst into tears. 17. Harold Gardner kept his peace until November 13th, the day before John Garton and Stephen Dubé were to go on trial in Derry District Court for the murder of Adrian Mellon. Then he went to see Tom Butilier. He wanted to talk about the clown. Butilier didn't, but when he saw Gardner might do something stupid without a little guidance, he did. There was no clown, Harold. The only clowns out that night were those 3 kids. You know that as well as I do. We have 2 witnesses. Ah, that's crap. Unwin decided to bring on the one-armed man, as in we didn't kill the poor little faggot, it was the one-armed man. As soon as he understood he'd really gotten his buns into some hot water this time. Haggerty was hysterical. He stood by and watched those kids murder his best friend. Wouldn't have surprised me if he'd seen flying saucers. But Butilier knew better. Gardner could see it in his eyes, and the assistant DA's ducking and dodging irritated him. Come on, he said. We're talking about independent witnesses here. Don't bullshit me. Oh, you want to talk bullshit? Are you telling me you believe there was a vampire clown under the Main Street Bridge? Because that's my idea of bullshit. No, not exactly, but... Or that Haggerty saw a billion balloons under there, each imprinted with exactly the same thing as what was written on his lover's hat? Because that is also my idea of bullshit. No, but then why are you bothering with this? Stop cross-examining me, Gardner roared. They both described it the same, and neither knew what the other one was saying. But Tillier had been sitting at his desk, playing with a pencil. Now he put the pencil down, got up, and walked over to Harold Gardner. Tillier was 5 inches shorter, but Gardner retreated a step before the man's anger. Do you want us to lose this case, Harold? No. Of course not. Do you want those running sores to walk free? No. Okay. Good. Since we both agree on the basics, I'll tell you exactly what I think. Yes, there was probably a man under the bridge that night. Maybe he was even wearing a clown suit, although I've dealt with enough witnesses to guess maybe he was just a stew bum or a transient wearing a bunch of cast-off clothes. I think he was probably down there scrounging for dropped change or road meat. Half a burger someone chucked over the side, or maybe the crumbs from the bottom of a Frito bag. Their eyes did the rest, Harold. Now, is that possible? I don't know, Harold said. He wanted to be convinced, but given the exact tally of the two descriptions, no, he didn't think it was possible. Here's the bottom line. I don't care if it was Kinko the Clown, or a guy in an Uncle Sam suit on stilts, or Hubert the Happy Homo.